At the ends of the earth, there was a boy who used magic to create a building. Although he thought the building he created was small, but according to local residents, it was already a rather large structure for a rural area. That boy is the ruler of this land. Meanwhile, there was a man who had spent his entire life completely immersed in his work. He started working in the city right after graduation. And it has been 10 years since he left his hometown, and every morning he has to rush to catch the familiar train to get to work. On the other hand, the workload he has to complete is increasing, and he spends most of his time at the company. Although he still has some free time, it's only during the weekend hours that he reads novels. Unconsciously, this man lived a life without motivation, repeating the same routine day after day, simply lying down with his eyes closed. He hoped for a peaceful life, a safe home. Suddenly, a blinding flash of light appeared. This caused him to wake up in a completely different space from his familiar room. Before long, he realized his body had shrunk. He quickly stood up and checked the window, and he saw a completely unfamiliar landscape. Shortly afterward, a maid called him, and he discovered that he had been reincarnated as the son of a nobleman named Van. This maid's name is Till, a 12-year-old girl. Till was panicking because Van was playing near the window. Van later said that he just wanted to admire the scenery outside and was very impressed with the beautiful garden. Hearing Van's words, Till was surprised because Van, whom she usually served, could never have uttered such difficult words. Van is only 2 years old, but he pronounces words fluently like an adult. Suddenly, Van fell silent because deep down, he was still a 30-year-old man. He recalled being a corporate slave, living in a small apartment in Tokyo. He began to wonder about the meaning of his shrinking body and the maid's words. Suddenly, he also had memories of life in this place. Van then told Till that his full name was Van Ne Fertio. Till was overjoyed that Van, despite being only 2 years old, could say his name fluently. Van then mentioned his father's name, Jalpa Fertio, and his siblings Murcia, Jardo, and Sesto. Till was immediately surprised that Van could fluently say the names of his father and siblings, although they rarely meet for meals. The head of the family and Van's father, Jalpa Fertio, along with Murcia's eldest son, Ilago Fertio, his second son, Jardogai Fertio, and his third son, Sesto Ele Fertio, were both present. Meanwhile, Van was cared for and pampered by the servants like the youngest child in the family. Of course, Van thoroughly enjoyed his dinner. Van realized that he had been reborn into this world, carrying memories of Japan. Although he couldn't fully accept this reality, he gradually realized that he had fallen into a completely different world. Suddenly, his father asked his second brother, Jardo, "What did you learn today?" Jardo stammered in reply that he had learned about fire magic and how to apply it in battle formations that day. It turned out his father was asking his children about what they had learned that day. Every evening, he would ask them, making it a daily routine. This was the aristocratic education his family pursued. Every morning, aristocratic children had to study, and in the afternoons they had to practice swordsmanship according to their age. Jalpa required all 4 of his sons to do this, and now it was Van's turn. Van said innocently, he replied that he would begin studying the history and culture of his country today. Hearing that answer, Van's 3 brothers were all shocked. Then Jalpa burst out laughing. He thought he had spoiled Van too much because Van was his youngest child, the only remaining child of his wife, Mila. But it turned out that Van had very mature thoughts. Even though he was only 2 years old, Jalpa was convinced that Van would one day become the most powerful fire mage. Just like him and Mila, he was very confident that their family would be incredibly strong, and he was also eagerly awaiting the evaluation of Van's magic. When Van turned 8, in the new world he experienced, magic had become commonplace. The most important thing was each individual's compatibility with magic, and every noble family placed great emphasis on this. Generally, there were 4 basic magical elements in this world: fire, water, wind, and earth. Other spells are human spells, and those who lack compatibility with one of these spells are often considered failures. Jalpa and Van's 3 brothers all possess compatibility with magical elements. According to Van, all magic is useful, depending on how it's used. The Fertio family is a noble family with significant influence in the kingdom's military. Furthermore, the Fertio family is renowned for their powerful fire magic. The world Van lives in has a civilization very similar to the Middle Ages. Moreover, in this world, not many people rely on gunpowder weapons as magic is easy to use. Basically, the weapons in this world are swords, spears, and bows and arrows, and the most important element of all those weapons is magic. The world Van lives in has 3 continents and countless islands, and Van currently resides on the western continent of Grant, specifically in the Kingdom of Scuderia. Over the past 300 years, the Kingdom of Scuderia has gradually expanded its territory, and to this day, the king continues to deploy his army to conquer smaller nations and acquire new lands. Van was sitting in a chair in his classroom. Then, Van mentioned the only port accessible by ship, explaining that if the monsters attacked while the ship was leaving the dock, the only way to get through would be via the route already taken. Till was surprised to hear Van's opinion. He was very interested because there were many different kinds of monsters in this world. Till then explained that species is a term used to refer to different kinds of living beings. Species such as elves, dwarves, and orcs often have civilizations and cultures similar to humans. At that moment, one of the maids reminded Van that it was time for lunch. However, Van said that he didn't feel tired because he still had so many things to be curious about. Van was more interested in the servants who continued to watch over and care for him. This came as a great surprise to Van's servants. It was the first time they had ever been treated with such care by a nobleman, and Van began asking his servants many questions. This piqued Espada's interest in Van. Espada then approached Van with a pile of books, saying that this was the perfect time for Van to learn to read and become familiar with numbers. Van was surprised because Espada was a talented servant who had devotedly served the family for many years, and it seemed this was the first time Espada had spoken to Van with such a serious look in his eyes. Espada said he only wanted to see how much Van could learn. Van felt a little intimidated by Espada's gaze and replied that he was still somewhat clumsy with writing. Then Espada began to test Van on mathematics, challenge him with simple addition and subtraction. Van calmly answered Espada's questions. Espada was quite satisfied and decided to teach Van twice a week. After that, Van began rigorous training sessions with Espada. It was an extremely difficult training program for a 2-year-old child, because there was so much to learn. Espada always taught Van without ever smiling. As a result, within just a few weeks, Van had become proficient in reading and writing, and he also learned many other things. After 2 years of diligent studying, Van is now 4 years old. Currently, Van is outdoors, holding a wooden stick and practicing with the servants. Although Van appears to be playing, he is actually practicing swordsmanship with his servants. The servants happily used wooden branches as swords to spar with Van, praising him a little along the way. Van was delighted as he found the activity incredibly enjoyable. Now it was Till's turn, the older man, to practice swordsmanship with Van. For a moment, Till, with her confidence, easily defeated Van. Till smiled triumphantly at his victory. This angered Van, who chased after Till, who just ran around laughing and joking. However, Till's actions made the other servants feel guilty towards Van. The servants then reprimanded Till and demanded that Van punish her. But Van felt it was unnecessary as he knew it was just a joke. However, the other servants insisted that such rough treatment of a noblewoman was unacceptable. Van frowned at Till and said that was her punishment. Till immediately apologized to Van. And Selv, who was also training with the servants, felt relieved. This lasted only half a year. Now 5 years old, Van has begun seriously studying swordsmanship. He occasionally spars with older children from the Knights Academy. Before his reincarnation, Van loved learning martial arts like judo and karate. Even though he was only allowed to use a wooden sword and the rules were quite simple, Van still found the training very enjoyable. He easily applied his knowledge of judo and karate to sword training, anticipating his opponent's movements and waiting for the opportune moment to launch an attack. That's a basic karate technique, so it can be applied to swordsmanship. Currently, Van's opponent is a 10-year-old child, meaning he's bigger and stronger than him. Furthermore, the weapon the opponent wielded created a significant gap between them. However, since the opponent was just a child, his movements were very monotonous. Van possessed an advantage in reflexes and agility. He easily dodged and defeated his opponents, much to the amazement of the Knights Academy cadets. Furthermore, Van's excellent treatment of his subordinates earned him a great deal of respect despite his young age. Shortly afterward, a large man approached Van. He was the vice headmaster of the Knights Academy, and he wanted to ask Van a few things, especially to see his hands. Confused, Van just remained silent and complied. Dono noticed that Van's hands had no scratches. In fact, they were very smooth. Van immediately withdrew his hand and said that he would practice harder when he grew up. Dono curiously asked if Van had ever undergone any special training before. Because he saw no signs that Van had practiced beforehand, Van replied that he only practiced as usual every day, and also said that he really enjoyed swordsmanship. Dono later stated that Espada had instructed him to triple Van's training volume compared to normal. Van was surprised to hear that. He thought such training was unnecessary. Van felt dizzy because Espada always made him train excessively from morning till night. Meanwhile, Dono was very excited about this training plan. Dono eagerly looked forward to training Van every day, hoping to help him become the best swordsman. Van stammered, saying that he enjoyed learning and was very passionate about swordsmanship, and would do his best in both. Dono understood and asked permission to become Van's private swordsmanship instructor. Unable to refuse any longer, Van reluctantly agreed. From then on, Van received private swordsmanship lessons from Dono. Dono trained Van very strictly, not even allowing him much rest. Even if Van takes a short break, Dono kept urging him to fight, not allowing him to sit down during breaks. This made Van feel a little uncomfortable with Dono. From afar, the other knights cheered on Van and his trainer. In addition, the servants who were very fond of Van also gave him extra motivation. Van realized that despite the difficulties, he still felt very excited about training. Van's life after his reincarnation was truly interesting. In her previous life, Van never experienced contentment and always lived a life devoid of joy. Therefore, Van resolved to live this life to the fullest. 3 years later, Van's promising life came to a sudden and abrupt end. 2 years have passed, and Van is now 8 years old. Van was sitting in his private carriage in the center of the market, completely overwhelmed by the bustling atmosphere. Till guided him. Till asked Van which area he wanted to visit, but Van only wanted to look around the bustling market. Now, at age 8, Van must live the life of an aristocratic boy, carrying within him the memories of 30 years spent on Earth. You have to study and practice every day. With his current abilities, Van could even defeat the younger fighters. The 12-year-old children had attracted too much attention from Van. In the aristocratic system, money, land, and power were the measures by which landowners were compared. Although Van didn't want to become the head of the family, he knew his life would become even more difficult. Furthermore, Van had siblings who would sooner or later try to kill him, a common occurrence among the nobility. Unfortunately, Van's relationship with his siblings wasn't good. Therefore, even though Van didn't want to be the head of the family, if he attracted too much attention, his siblings would kill him without hesitation. The key for Van is to try not to attract too much attention. Before long, a horse-drawn carriage stopped in the middle of the market. Van immediately got out of the car. Van decided to just be a normal child, someone who liked to play, and the first step was going shopping. Accompanied by his servants and personal guards, Van began strolling around the market. Finally, he arrived in the middle of the market. The place left him utterly amazed because the Maria shopping center was incredibly vast. Suddenly, shouts echoed from afar, loud enough to attract Van's attention. A man is dragging a child who is wearing dirty clothes. Feeling like he was being watched, the man immediately yelled at Van, causing the soldiers to draw their swords. While trying to reassure the guards, Van asked why the child was chained up. The man yelled at Van roughly, saying it was his business because the child was his. The man intended to sell the child into slavery to pay off his debts. Confused, Van continued to ask questions, and the man explained about the slave system in their country. Slavery was divided into 2 types: debt slavery and criminal slavery. In reality, poor families had to sell their children, whom they could no longer afford to raise, into slavery to earn money to survive. The children, sold due to debt, become slaves because of it. The group then realizes the harsh reality of this world. In a place where slavery is still commonplace and familiar, people have become all too accustomed to it. Suddenly, from a distance, a woman who was polishing a tire approached and greeted Van. Van was surprised that this mysterious woman recognized him. It turned out that Van was quite popular in the market, known as the magic child for his enthusiasm. This mysterious woman's name is Rosalie. She intended to give Van and the guards a tour of the market. The rude man, upon hearing all this, suddenly trembled. He realized he had just scolded the child of a powerful woman. The man suddenly became naive and asked Rosalie about the price of the child he intended to sell. Rosalie thought for a moment, then asked the child what kind of magic it possessed. The man replied that the child had the magic to steal. Rosalie then said that the child's price, if enslaved, would only be 3 silver coins. Hearing this, the man angrily shouted. Because he had previously been told that the child's price was 5 large silver coins, he immediately demanded that Rosalie raise the price. However, Rosalie calmly replied that, in any shop, the selling price was usually only half its actual value, so 3 silver coins would suffice. If the sled were Rosalie's daughter, she might consider raising the price, but since the child was a boy and very young, its usefulness was not yet clear. After hearing Rosalie's explanation, the enraged man began kicking the child he intended to enslave. The man was very angry because the child was supposed to bring him some money. Seeing the tense situation, Rosalie tried to stop him, but the man paid no attention to what she said. In his despair, he dragged the child toward another slave shop. Suddenly, Van announced that he will buy the child for 5 large silver coins. Then he took a deep breath, feeling that his decision was the right one, because the child would be killed if left as it was. The man then asked Van if he had enough money. Van quickly produced some silver for the transaction. Rosalie offered to act as their intermediary. After receiving the money, the man quickly left. Van helped the child stand up and introduce himself. The child's name is Kamshin. Van then told Kamshin that he could go wherever he wanted. Till asked about Van's decision. Van replied that he only wanted to save Kamshin. But suddenly Van remembered that if he left Kamshin alone, Van's father would come looking for him again. Van would be considered irresponsible if he left Kamshin alone. Van then asked Kamshin if he had anywhere to go home. Kamshin remained silent, so Van offered Kamshin the position of his personal bodyguard at his house. The guards accompanying Van seemed to disagree with this decision, believing it to be very dangerous given that Kamshin's origins were still unclear. Therefore, Van's personal guard suggested taking Kamshin away to be branded a slave. Ben then asked Kamshin if he agreed, and Kamshin didn't seem to object at all. Once they both agreed, Van took Kamshin shopping for suitable clothes. However, Rosalie immediately stopped them, demanding that the slave contract be fulfilled first. Rosalie then asked Kamshin and Van to hold out their hands. Immediately she performed a spell, and the mark of slavery appeared on Kamshin's hand. Rosalie explained that this mark would not disappear as long as the contract remained in effect. Then Rosalie immediately led Van and the group away, and they quickly went to a clothing store to buy clothes for Kamshin. Kamshin remained silent, although Kamshin's face couldn't hide his happiness. With Rosalie's help, Van quickly selected the necessary clothes for Kamshin. In Van's mind, he didn't understand what was happening. Since it was his first day outside the castle, Van bought a slave. But perhaps that's not important right now. Back at the castle, Kamshin, who had become Van's personal bodyguard, called him into his room. Kamshin said that Deputy Commander Dono was looking for Van. Van didn't want to be disturbed, so he bribed Kamshin with a piece of cake so that he wouldn't tell Dono where he was. Kamshin immediately ate the cake. Van was surprised to realize that Kamshin wasn't wearing gloves, making the slave marks on his hands clearly visible. However, Kamshin didn't seem to care much. He viewed the slave mark as a symbol of the bond between him and Van. Van said the gloves had been specially purchased for Kamshin. Kamshin immediately put on his gloves. Van didn't expect Kamshin to always carry gloves with him. Suddenly, Dono called from outside. Van immediately hid, while Kamshin concealed Van's whereabouts. Dono asked Kamshin where Van was, and of course Kamshin insisted he didn't know. However, Dono noticed that Kamshin had just eaten something because he saw crumbs of bread left in his mouth. Kamshin quickly wiped away the crumbs and pretended not to notice anything. Dono realized that Kamshin had been bribed by Van. This angered Dono because Kamshin had disregarded his orders as the deputy commander of the Knight's Order. However, Kamshin replied that he was Van's slave, and therefore he only obeyed Van's orders. Hearing this, Dono had no reason to argue anymore, as there was nothing left for him to do. Dono then decided to let Kamshin replace Van in his rigorous training. Kamshin couldn't refuse and had no choice but to comply. Van could only peek through the crack in the door, hoping to be even lazier. He hoped that people would change their perception of him, from a magical child to a normal child. From now on, Van is 8 years old. Everyone was eager to know which magic would suit him. They all believed that Van would possess a powerful spell, thanks to his learning ability and swordsmanship skills. Some people even wanted Van to be the next landowner. Everyone thought that Van would at least possess magic related to the fire or wind elements. In a room at the castle, Van faces a bitter reality. None of the elements suit him. The men in the room could only remain silent, unable to believe it. It turns out Van possesses the magic of creativity. Creative magic was used to produce goods, and according to magical texts, it is considered the most useless magic in the world. This is because magic requires the preparation of materials such as earth and iron to create items that already exist in the user's imagination. Furthermore, using this magic to create items isn't very efficient. Other mages could also do this using powerful magic to create weapons or other items. Since blacksmiths didn't need magic to create weapons, Van realized that his creative magic might not be useful in the eyes of many. Despite the unfavorable circumstances, Van was quite relieved that the magic test results weren't what he'd expected. He wouldn't be targeted by his brothers in their power struggles. Everyone knows that what nobles crave is one of the 4 elements: fire, water, wind, or earth. Of these 4 elements, the element that Furtio's family desired most was fire. Van's eldest brother possessed the element of wind, thanks to his mother's connection. He struggled more than his brothers to reach this position, and was mocked by the second and third brothers, as both possessed the wind element. Therefore, elemental compatibility was extremely important to the nobles. Their father, Jalpa, was furious. Upon learning that his youngest son possessed absolutely no elemental magic, Jalpa was deeply disappointed. He had very high expectations for Van, believing that since he and his wife were powerful fire mages, their child would surely possess no magic other than fire. However, Van's creative magic was unexpected. Even so, this is not incomprehensible, as Van was the youngest child, abandoned by his own mother. Although Van's mother possessed powerful magic, she was frail and died shortly after giving birth to Van. Therefore, it's not difficult to understand why Van's father had such high expectations of him. Suddenly, Jalpa drew his sword. He felt incredibly foolish for having ever considered Van a well-behaved child. Van remained silent, unable to do anything else, when he saw his own father draw his sword and pointed at him. Because organizing a birthday celebration for a sorcerer with creative magical abilities was ridiculous, Jalpa felt embarrassed. He thought his son, Van, should be eliminated. As Jalpa prepared to swing his sword, Von Mercia's older brother immediately stepped in front of Von to protect him. Mercia hesitantly explained to his father that there was another way without having to eliminate Van. Jalpa was confused and wanted more explanation from Mercia. Mercia then explained that they could give Von a village on the border as territory. Their father was surprised and asked for further explanation. Mercia went on to explain that the village has 100 residents. The village lies to the north, at the foot of Mount Walsberg, a place of nothing particularly special or useful, because many powerful magical creatures have chosen to nest there. In addition, near the village lived a lord with a small population, and on the other side was the rival kingdom of Ionetta. This made the village quite remote, but it had a fortress with strong defenses. Mercia went on to explain that, in other words, the village could at least have been used as a stopover point for training soldiers from Lord Fernard, who sometimes organized expeditions. This village was under Mercia's control, and occasionally, Lord Ferdinand's growing territory would send troops to inspect the area. In other words, although the land was completely useless, it could still be given to Van. Furthermore, making Van the lord of the village would increase the villagers' loyalty to the local residents. After hearing Mercia's explanation, Jalpa finally understood and decided to entrust the nameless village to Van. Then, Jalpa immediately left the room and urged them to set off for the village. Meanwhile, Van's other siblings smiled, pleased with the results of their recent magic tests. After everyone had left the room, Mercia immediately bowed her head and apologized to Van. Actually, Mercia simply didn't want the terrible things she experienced as a child to happen to Van, so she felt that keeping him away was the right thing to do. However, Van felt that his sister didn't need to apologize to him, because to Van, his sister had helped him a great deal. Without Mercia, he might have been killed, or worse, enslaved. Van later said that although the path he had to take was fraught with despair, he would seize this opportunity to the fullest. Mercia was very impressed when she heard this and thought that Van was indeed a child prodigy. She was very touched that Van had such a sensitive heart, like an adult. Mercia also shared that she had been quietly following Van's development all this time, and she felt he had been through a lot of bad things. Marcus's family also abandoned him. However, Mercia promised to provide Van with as much assistance as possible in the future, and she will fight for him. Van is very grateful to Mercia. In Van's room, his personal servants couldn't accept and refused to believe that Van possessed no elemental magic at all. They all felt that Van was a good and great nobleman. Therefore, the idea of him being sent to a remote village was almost impossible. However, Van was actually looking forward to this trip, because for him, it was an opportunity to escape the hardships of aristocratic life, the beginning of freedom. He considered it a dream come true. With the determination to live a peaceful and happy life, Van also wants to make this place a better place. The adventure group, tasked with escorting a young nobleman, they realized that although the nobility always rode in luxurious horse-drawn carriages, and contempt for ordinary people, but they couldn't refuse this task. While on the territory of the Murcia Feltio family, no matter what happens. Shortly afterwards, Van, who had ordered the adventure group to escort him, also arrived. Van politely introduced himself to Orto, the leader of the adventure group. Orto felt a little nervous as he returned Van's greeting, but he immediately realized that the boy was very polite. Van also didn't forget to compliment Orto's muscular physique, which surprised him quite a bit. After that, Van became very friendly with the rest of the adventure group, who would be escorting him. Orto was the leader of the group. He observed Van closely and found his unusual behavior puzzling. Immediately after Van finished the meeting and left, the adventurers were deeply impressed by his exceptional politeness. They no longer thought of Van as just an ordinary aristocratic child they had met before. Meanwhile, elsewhere, preparations were underway to load all the belongings onto a sturdy horse-drawn cart. Van checked each step carefully, thoroughly considering what needed to be prepared for his trip to his new territory. He will use 3 carriages for this journey. Initially, he was only given a small carriage for transportation, along with a few servants. However, several others also joined this journey, including Till and Espada. Even Espada insisted on resigning from his position as chief vassal to serve Van. Espada explained that he wanted a more relaxed life, living in the countryside. Although Van couldn't stop others from joining him, he himself couldn't hide his delight. Van admitted that he was genuinely happy about these changes. Because others also wanted to go with Van, Till explained that the other servants actually wanted to go with Van too, but only she was allowed, as she was Van's personal maid. Till also shared that the palace servants were very fond of Van, because he was the only one who treated them well. For example, Mercia is very busy, therefore she rarely spoke to her attendants, while Jardo and Sesto were reluctant to interact much with them. But in the palace, Van always greeted the servants. Occasionally, Van would give them food and help them clean up. Hearing Till's confession, Van felt a little embarrassed. Then Van asked why Kamshin had joined. Kamshin replied that he was bound by a slave contract, which could not be changed or broken. In other words, he would dedicate his entire life to Van, ready to sacrifice his life to protect his master. Van teased Kamshin about being too ostentatious. But when Van saw Kamshin's serious expression, he realized that Kamshin genuinely liked him, not just admired him. Van felt embarrassed by that admission. After making his preparations, Van immediately set off for the suburban village. He deliberately omitted the Marquez family crest from the carriage to avoid attracting attention. Van plans to leave the city completely. As the carriage rolled along, Van looked out the window and took in the quiet atmosphere around him. A little while later, a gatekeeper boy whom Van knew ran up and asked him where he was going. This left Van feeling confused. Van felt incredibly embarrassed when the gatekeeper boy shouted to the whole town that Van was about to leave the city. A feeling of unease welled up in Van, and he immediately questioned one of the soldiers about it. Because, on his father's orders, he was not allowed to reveal his departure. The soldier explained that it was Dano's doing because he felt sorry for Van's situation, and his impending departure was like an act of desertion. Therefore, Dano at least wanted people to know about Van's passing. The soldier added that they had just received instructions not to disclose it to the surrounding residents. He also said that Dono had fallen asleep in the carriage, and that when he woke up, they would ask him to leave. Because of Dono's actions, the atmosphere in the city immediately became lively. Residents familiar with Van gathered to bid him farewell. And this clearly shows how much they like Van. They wish him a safe departure. Van simply smiled happily when he realized that he was still loved by the townspeople. That night, while everyone else was resting, Van and the group of mercenaries protecting him had dinner. They had passed through 2 cities and had now reached the first campsite. This was also the first time Van had encountered dangers from magical creatures while camping outdoors. This time, they had 2 additional mercenaries as bodyguards. One of them was Orto, the group leader and a seasoned adventurer. With 20 years of experience, Orto was accustomed to negotiating with mission leaders. Even though Van was only 8 years old, Orto took his task very seriously. Van then told Orto to rest and take turns with the other mercenaries. Orto seemed surprised to hear this. Van asked why Orto was confused, but Orto evaded the question and immediately returned to his guard post. Seeing Orto's actions, Van continued to question Till. Till replied that the mercenaries were all very impressed with Van's nobility. The following morning, the group continued their journey towards the suburban village, which had become Van's new area of power. They traveled from city to city and camped at night. In total, they spent a day resting in 4 cities. Because they had to carry their belongings, they moved quite slowly. After 2 weeks of travel, they had covered a total of 100 kilometers in a single day. Although traveling 500 to 1,000 kilometers was already considered a great distance, this demonstrates just how vast the Marquis family's territory was. At one point during the journey, Till said they would soon arrive, bringing everyone a sense of relief that the journey was nearing its end. However, from outside, the coachman informed Van that something dangerous was happening in his village. He said that his village was under attack by something. Upon hearing that the real village was under attack, Van immediately gathered all his servants and guards to devise a plan. Orto believes the village is currently under attack by bandits or mercenaries, and he advises everyone to hide if they are afraid to fight. The village was surrounded by thick wooden walls, making it difficult for attackers to use bows and arrows. In front of the gate stood armored soldiers, and behind them were the magical troops. The enemy numbered around 40 to 50, so they were facing a situation where they knew little about their foe, but Dono had asked permission to join the battle, believing that if they fought together, they would have a chance of victory. However, Orto felt that was too dangerous and refused Dono's request. Although Dono understood the consequences and was willing to sacrifice himself for Van's territory, Orto remained steadfast in his principles. He refused to sacrifice his team members. Although Orto received a considerable sum of money, Dono remains determined to defend Van to the very end. Espada also rejected Dono's offer. Espada believed he could fight 30 people alone, including the magical army, and had a 50-50 chance of winning. If he died, there would be no one left to rule Van's village. However, Orto still refused to let them join the battle. Meanwhile, the Espada proved themselves masters of the four elements, more powerful than the bandits themselves. Orto was surprised to see that the Espada could fight like that. Instead of continuing the direct battle, they devised a plan. First, they would build a defensive wall, then the expedition team would attack from behind the wall. When the enemy's attention was diverted, Dono and the rest would attack from the flank. Their chances of winning would be higher if they consistently launched surprise attacks. Their sole objective was to distract their opponent. Van then asked if Espada was willing to defend from behind and fight the bandits. Espada replied that he would act as bait, continue the attack from behind the wall, and protect Dono and the others. Upon hearing this, Van disagreed, saying it was too risky. Espada could die. However, Espada accepted the consequences of this decision. Upon hearing this, Van offered to be the bait. Everyone was immediately surprised by Van's words. Till immediately shouted and protested. Her eyes welled up with tears. She didn't want this to happen because she'd rather fight the enemy herself. Meanwhile, the Espada also wanted to stop the enemy. But Van quickly interrupted Espada, saying that he was the one in command here. Van immediately ordered the remaining men, instructing Orto and the others to escort him to the village without engaging in combat to save it. As a nobleman, Van told Espada that despite having withdrawn from his noble family, he still carried a sense of responsibility and gratitude towards the family that had contributed so much to him. Van could not allow himself to die here. Meanwhile, Dono and the knights, who were royal knights, had to serve his father, not Van. Therefore, he had to apologize to his father if anything happened to the knights. Van also advised Till that he considered her like a brother, had spent more time with her than anyone else, and therefore did not want to see his brother die. Finally, Van tells Espada that he appreciates Espada's honesty, so even though Espada is Van's slave, he doesn't need to die for Van. Van realized he was useless and was expelled from his aristocratic family. Although those who wanted to follow him were all good people and didn't deserve to die, but Van couldn't just stand still and give orders. Van couldn't stand still. He wanted to take responsibility and be on the front lines. After delivering his message, Van outlined the plan. First, they would ride forward on horseback. Van wanted everyone to attack from both the left and right flanks, while reminding them not to forget long-range attacks, which was their main strategy. If the enemy doesn't retreat, they might escape. Van told them they could leave his body there. As long as his noble identity is not revealed, there is nothing to worry about. After hearing Van's explanation, Orto acted immediately. He said this time he would risk his life because Orto didn't want a young child to have to sacrifice their life just to take responsibility. One of Orto's members, Puriel, told Van that he had once been deceived by the nobles and found them to be all talk and no action. However, Van was different because he not only remembered each person's name but was also willing to sacrifice his life for them. Dono and the other members realized this, and they were all ready to jump into the fight for Van. The knights who served the Ferrer family, they viewed protecting Van as protecting the future of their own family. Espada, after listening to everyone, approached Van and reminded him that after the war, Van must always remember the responsibilities and duties of a nobleman. Finally, Espada ordered everyone to rest in preparation for the upcoming confrontation. Within the next 3 days, the battle will be over, as the Espada are deemed vigilant enough to lead. He quickly assumed command and began adjusting the strategy. His plan involved creating a defensive line against long-range attacks. Dono and his knights would attack from the left, while Orto and his adventurers would advance from the right. Van and the servants who were not fighting would stay around the carriage to provide support when needed. They moved quickly thanks to the Espada's ability to control the ground. He erected a solid defensive wall around the formation. After the defensive wall was erected, the warriors began to advance. Orto was very impressed with Espada's abilities. With his talents in all 4 elements of magic, Espada was clearly a person far beyond the role of a servant. A member of Orto's expedition realized that if Orto refused Van's request, Van might actually sacrifice his own life. Orto understood that Van was very valuable and that a nobleman like him shouldn't have to die at this time. He hoped that Van could become king in the future. After 2 weeks of companionship, Orto's view of nobility had changed. He never expected to find a nobleman like Van. He was a man who would not hesitate to sacrifice himself for the benefit of others. Although he didn't fully understand Van, Orto was very impressed by his willingness and courage. his readiness to sacrifice his life for others to fulfill his responsibilities. As soon as everyone had finished preparing the plan, Van was hugged tightly by Espada, and both of them cried with emotion. They were very grateful and did not want to continue being used as bait. Van realized they were like family. He quickly reassured them and said that if there was anything they could do right now, they should act immediately. Then Van instructed both of them to help immediately if the situation worsened. And so the war will begin. Before long, the bandits began attacking the village with apparent nonchalance, inflicting heavy damage on the surrounding settlements. The attack on the small village was nearing its end, as the villagers fought to defend their territory. Then arrows from Van's group suddenly rained down. The robbers began to panic and try to escape, but they were met with a wall blocking their way. While they were in disarray, the robbers were attacked from two sides by Dono and Ordo's forces. Dono, the seasoned knight, effortlessly wielded his massive sword, demonstrating his strength. He was the deputy commander of the 1st Clan Cavalry Unit. The robbers scattered in all directions, but it was all in vain as Orto and his team caught up with them. As Orto and his allies began their attack, a bandit unexpectedly escaped and ran toward the wall. Orto immediately shouted for the robber to be apprehended, because he needed to be stopped immediately to protect the attacking team from a distance, because they couldn't see the approaching enemy due to the wall blocking their view. With no time to spare, Orto ordered the ranged assault team to continue their preparations. As a robber was approaching from behind the wall, Puriel, who was on guard duty, didn't have time to dodge. Those behind the wall were completely unaware of the enemy's arrival. As the robber prepared to swing his axe, Van and Kamshin immediately rushed to help. Van quickly attracted the attention of the large robber, leaving Puriel bewildered as he was no match for Van. However, surprisingly, thanks to the flexible collaboration between Van and Kamshin, they both defeated the robber. Puriel was astonished, as it was rare to see a child move so nimbly. Van immediately ordered the men behind the wall to stand guard, to prepare for a counterattack from the enemy. The rescue of the village was successful, although a few robbers managed to escape. But the attacking group was defeated without anyone being injured. They had dealt with the bandits who had attacked the village. The mercenaries quickly tied up the bandits to hand them over to the royal army and receive their reward. After receiving half of the requested amount, they would carefully fulfill Van's request. However, Orto still wanted to stay in the village for a while. Meanwhile, some members of his mercenary group wanted to return immediately because they had work in another area. Orto understood and agreed to let some of them leave immediately. Some will stay with Orto to settle down in the village, while others will venture into the surrounding forests and mountains to hunt monsters temporarily. At this point, Puriel told Orto that she felt Van was no ordinary nobleman. Orto agreed with Puriel's assessment, and this only made him want to stay in the village even more. He was curious about what Van would become in the future. Orto felt that possessing such sharp thinking was something not everyone had, even for an educated nobleman like himself. When Orto first met Van, he seemed like just an ordinary nobleman. But as soon as Van began to speak, that image vanished. Van was polite and steadfast, yet often appeared cheerful and friendly. Despite being a nobleman, Orto did not sense any arrogance or contempt in Van's eyes. The mercenary group members agreed with Orto's observation. They then discussed what Van had said earlier, that his magic wasn't suited for combat. Van remained determined to sacrifice himself to protect everyone, even though he knew he couldn't fight as a true warrior. Len Peru, one of the companions, recalled that Van had helped him when he was in trouble and felt the need to repay him. Another mercenary remarked that Van's movements were not at all childlike, but rather exuded the ferocity of a seasoned warrior. Orto, who had witnessed it all, admitted that Van surpassed every nobleman he had ever known, and he hoped that one day he would see Van become a lord, leading a land of his own. Then Ordo asked his teammates if they wanted to stay and help Van, and they all decided to stay and support Van. Meanwhile, Till was worried and reproached Van for acting first, asking him to let Champson handle it instead. Despite being exhausted, Van reluctantly followed Till's advice, accepting his own sacrifice. While Van was comforting Till, who was still sobbing, suddenly Puriel stepped into their conversation with a hint of teasing. She said that even though Van was very young, he had already made women cry. Van, with an innocent expression, replied that he was simply being honest with Till because Till was very important to him. This remark made Till, who was crying, suddenly feel ashamed. Puriel then said seriously that he felt Van was like an elf because elves never seem to age. Van smiled in response, saying that was impossible, since he had been taken care of by Till since he was a child. So Van was definitely a normal person. Puriel went on to ask where Van had learned to use a sword. Van replied that he had learned directly from Dono, a powerful knight of the kingdom. Puriel comforted Van, assuring him that he had learned wisdom and knowledge from the Espada, which Van happily agreed with and added that he was still influenced by Till. Puriel, moved by Van's actions, she bowed her head in gratitude to Van, and she swore she would never forget what Van had done. With a friendly smile, Van said it wasn't a big deal. That smile was something Puriel couldn't help but admire. And she admired Van. Meanwhile, Espada announced that he had gathered the villagers around the gate. Van then prepared for his first meeting with the villagers. When the situation stabilizes, the residents finally gathered in large numbers in front of the village gate. Van stood up and introduced himself as the new owner, the one who would lead and govern this land. Village Chief Rhonda, with a grateful expression, thanked Van for his timely assistance to the village during its time of need. He quickly summarized the situation, explaining that the village had never been guarded by knights until now. This made Rhonda feel guilty, and she apologized on behalf of Fertio's family. Determined to protect his village, Van asserted that he would take responsibility and defend it like a lord. Van's introduction went smoothly with the confident demeanor of a seasoned businessman. After listening to him, Rhonda took Van to his home, where he would explain the village's situation in more detail. In her humble home, Rhonda revealed that the village currently has 150 inhabitants. But after just 1 month of attacks by the bandits, the population has significantly declined. The village now has only 100 inhabitants, and today marks the 3rd day of the bandit attacks. The robbers who attacked were not just one group, but several different groups. Village Chief Rhonda couldn't help but wonder why so many gangs were targeting his small village. He explained that because the village was located right on the border of the Kingdom of Yarnetta, border guards under Count Ferdinand regularly patrolled the area. However, after a change in leadership, the area had become unprotected. Van quickly realized that everything was due to a mistake in the Fertio family's handling of the area. Van pointed out that previously, Count Ferdinand, the former leader of the region, had appointed a deputy to each town, but now things had changed. However, Van's father, Jalpa Fertio, had only sent a lieutenant to govern the large cities, completely unaware of the situation in small villages like these. Chief Rhonda realized that their village wasn't worth protecting, as it contributed little to the tax revenue and was virtually worthless. Van firmly stated that instead of complaining about the state of the country, they should discuss the future of their village together, because complaining won't change anything. Upon hearing Van's words, Malaga, the village chief's eldest son, stood up, his body trembling with anger. Van calmly ordered Malaga to sit down, saying that only when they had calmed down could they discuss the future of the village together. Malaga reluctantly sat down, but her eyes betrayed her anger. Van continued to explain that, as nobles, they bore a great responsibility in restoring order and rectifying the errors in the laws, errors that were created by the Berlinate family, the founders of this kingdom. Upon hearing these words, the entire room fell silent. Espada cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence. Then, Van presented his vision to everyone in the village. Van believed that even though the villagers complained about the laws of the nobility and the rules of the kingdom, but that wouldn't change anything anyway. Van had set 3 specific goals. First, to make the village valuable, so that the kingdom could no longer underestimate them. Second, to raise money and recruit powerful groups of knights. And finally, to reorganize and develop the village. That was Van's vision for the village. Van thought that if they lived in a remote area, even though they could sell wood or stone, making a profit would be difficult due to high transportation costs. However, it would be more beneficial if the villagers knew how to create valuable handicrafts, despite their limited education. This made it difficult for the villagers to earn money and prevented them from developing their village. With determination, Van explained that it had been difficult for them to get this far, but he had come here to learn and protect this place. Van hoped the best they could do was survive and develop the village from now on. However, both the village chief and the elders remained skeptical. At this point, Espada interrupted the conversation. He introduced himself as the head of the Fertio family's service. He said that Van was an extraordinary child, appointed lord of the place at the tender age of 8. Moreover, his talent had been known since childhood. Espada also introduced Dono, the deputy commander of the Fertio family cavalry. The village chief was deeply moved, for finally an important figure from a noble family had appeared. At first, Malaga was skeptical, but as he listened to Van's explanation, he gradually became enthusiastic and full of confidence that the village would be saved. Malaga thought Van was a nobleman possessing 4-element magic, but Van denied it, pointing out that he only had creative magic, which couldn't be relied upon in combat. After hearing Van's words, the villagers' hopes were almost completely dashed. Van immediately suggested reinforcing the walls to protect the village from the enemy. Van explained that although the wooden fences looked sturdy, they were useless against rockets, just like the houses in the village. Van then ordered Espada to immediately use earth magic to create a solid foundation for the new wall. Van ordered his team to place stones on the wall's surface for reinforcement, and to dig a moat around it to prevent surprise attacks. He also suggested setting traps in the trenches and attacking the enemy from atop the defensive walls. Van agreed with his plan and asked for bows and arrows to be prepared. Once the plan was ready, Van told Rhonda to gather the villagers to introduce themselves and present their vision. During the meeting in the village field, Van explains the steps in the village's development, and he called on everyone to work together to build a prosperous community. After the presentation was over, a resident asked about taxes. The villagers explained that collecting a 30% tax on hunted products such as animal hides and monster teeth was very difficult for them. Upon hearing this, Van decided to reduce the tax to just 10%, hoping to improve the quality of life for the villagers. When they heard this announcement, the villagers were all astonished and surprised. Van thought that if they couldn't pay the taxes, they would be forced to sell their children. Then, another villager suggested that Van bring a group of knights to deal with the bandits. However, Van explained that this would be difficult to do as it would take 2 weeks for them to arrive, plus another week of preparation, totaling 2 to 3 weeks before knights could come to help. Furthermore, they would only be staying temporarily and couldn't provide long-term support. Because of the great distance, there could be delays, or the knights might not even arrive. This is why the village was often neglected. Hearing this, the villagers began to feel frustrated. Van went on to explain that they might feel upset, but the kingdom currently lacked enough knights or budget to support so many areas. Besides, the knights sent here were very likely to perish, leaving only a few behind. Although they could assemble an army, it would require at least 200 men. Furthermore, Van stated that they needed money to purchase food, horses, armor, and other equipment. Hiring adventure groups would be prohibitively expensive. Van then instructed Espada to use his powerful earth magic to create an earthen wall inside the village fence. With confidence, Espada created a massive stone wall right inside the wooden fence. Van explained that the cooperation of the villagers was more important than anything else, including the knights. If they live and thrive together here, the village will flourish much more than it did before. That evening, since Van's house was unavailable, his followers decided to camp in their vehicles and use camping equipment. Village Chief Rhonda tried to invite Van to his home to rest, but Van couldn't possibly refuse the elders' sincere invitation. Sitting around the warm campfire, Van reflected that so far, he hadn't really gotten the hang of his creation magic, but Van vowed not to give up. Van didn't need to rely on what a 4-element mage could do. He was determined to accomplish everything himself. Although most villagers remained skeptical, what he needed to do now was win their trust in order to improve everyone's lives. The first thing Van thought of was how to deal with the bandits. He believed that with his magical powers of creation, he could protect the village and make it a safe place. A place where people can live comfortably and happily. Sitting around a warm campfire, Van said that they should not only defend but also be able to attack without being attacked first. Rhonda, sitting beside him, agreed with his words. Van explained that attacks often came from above, with fire magic aimed at the walls. Espada concurred and said that if the walls were too low, the effectiveness of the attacks would be diminished. Rhonda worried that gaps in the wooden fence could be exploited by the enemy to breach the walls. Dono believed that this was precisely how the bandits would try to break through the village's defenses. Van suggested using a trebuchet, but Espada disagreed, arguing that trebuchets were only suitable for attacking barricades, not for defense. Rhonda, who had never seen one, asked Dono about it. Dono explained that catapults were a type of weapon used to throw large stones, but they were very slow and inaccurate, so they were often used to demolish castle walls and watchtowers. However, Van had a different idea for using this catapult. Van proposed using a mechanism to launch multiple stones at once and hurl them outwards, scattering them in all directions. Furthermore, they can add fuel to the fire to increase the effectiveness of the attack. Following Dono's suggestion, Espada and Rhonda could only remain silent. They then asked who had come up with this mechanism, and Van replied softly that it was his idea. Everyone fell silent again. The following day, Van was determined to prove that his created magic wasn't useless. He hadn't yet fully grasped its potential, so he had to find a way to explore and master it. Throughout the journey to the village, Van practiced diligently. Van creates various materials from wood, And now he's preparing to test his magic in a real-world setting to see what it can do. Steel, iron, and other materials had been created by Van through his magic, and now was the perfect time to prove his abilities. Deep in the forest, Orto and his group of hunters were patrolling to find the escaped bandits. They had cleared several areas, so it was now safe to leave the village. In addition, Ordo also wanted to hunt monsters around the village to earn money. Suddenly, Ordo sensed something. He spotted traces of the monster and immediately ordered a patrol ahead. Meanwhile, Van, Tail, and Kamshin stood guard around the area, felling trees. Van was deeply impressed by Orto's extraordinary intuition. Throughout the journey, Orto was always able to sense the presence of monsters before they attacked. Kamshin suggested cutting down some more trees, preparing for any eventuality. However, the trees Kamshin suggested were too large and too dense, making it impossible for them to cut them down. After gathering some wood, Van decided to try using his magic. He tried to vividly visualize the object he wanted to create using magic. For the magic to work, he had to visualize it in great detail in his mind, imagining everything clearly while using the spell. Van felt a warm sensation spreading down her stomach. And as the magic spreads to your fingertips, the visualization should be as small and detailed as possible. He had to pay attention to each grain of wood, trying to connect them together, joining the wood fibers into a unified mass. Van then succeeded in connecting the smallest wood fibers, and he created a block of wood. Although made of wood, this block looked like plastic. Van succeeded in transforming logs into boxes made from wood fibers, a completely new material that Kamshin and Till had never seen before. Confident in the strength of their creation, Van believed they were even stronger than ordinary wood and could serve as the foundation for their headquarters. Once finished, they loaded the boxes onto a horse-drawn cart. Not long after, Orto and his expedition returned from the forest, carrying their prey. Seeing the number of wooden boxes, Puriel curiously asked why there were so many boxes when they were only there to collect wood. Orto then lifted a box and was surprised to find it lighter and stronger than he had imagined. To test its durability, Orto drew his sword and tried slashing at the box. Then he threw it at the rocks to check if the box is broken. The box that Van made only had minor scratches. The rock behind it was cracked and broken. Van was extremely surprised that his item was not destroyed, while Orto was puzzled because he had struck the box with all his might. Van innocently asked which is harder, stone or wood, and Van smiled, proud that they had at least succeeded in creating a tough material. As the group sat in the carriage, Van continued to use magic to create other items, as if his magical energy had not yet run out. Kamshin, surprised, asked Van if his magic still had enough energy, since creative magic usually consumes a lot of power. Van created many intricately shaped items, starting with small objects and continuing to test his magical abilities by crafting a normal-sized weapon. He focused on imagining a weapon that was both as sturdy and sharp as possible. In just a moment, Van successfully created a katana sword. He gave the sword to Kamshin, who was very excited about the gift, and Kamshin promised to take good care of it. At the same time, Till, who was also very impressed, received a weapon from Van. Although somewhat hesitant because of its shape, Van reluctantly gave Till a dagger with a skull symbol, and Till accepted it, albeit with a little fear. Seeing this, Till thought that Van would like an axe. He said that he had made it very sturdy and that it could also be used as a hammer or a spear. After hearing Van's explanation, Till happily accepted the axe and promised to take good care of it. With a smile on his face, Van felt delighted to see Till enjoy the gift he had made. Looking at his body, Van noticed he never felt tired, which puzzled him as he couldn't understand how his magical energy could last so long. However, this opens up a unique possibility. His creative magic can be used in unique and useful ways. At the same time, the village's defensive wall was completed, something Van had been planning for a long time. With Esparta's abilities, this sturdy wall only took about 10 days to build. Ordo looked up from below, his eyes filled with admiration at the work Esparta had created, a sturdy structure that would now protect the entire village. Esparta, with his ability to activate multiple spells simultaneously, continued to approach Van. Van explained to Ordo that Esparta was an excellent servant, always quietly supporting the nobles from behind the scenes. Puriel was impressed by the result of the wall created by Esparta. She remarked that mages like Esparta should be recruited into the army, and if Esparta were an adventurer, he would surely be at the top of the rankings. Van was deeply grateful, expressing his profound appreciation and hoping Esparta would choose to stay with him during his retirement years. Ordo agreed, emphasizing that the future was more important than the past. Puriel was pleased to see that Esparta's glorious years were being appreciated as they deserved. A moment later, footsteps echoed from behind Van, and it turned out to be Espada, who approached and announced that he would be tutoring Van for a week. Van, unprepared, could only remain silent as Esparta dragged him away. Esparta hastily fabricated various excuses to avoid studying, claiming he had to reinforce the village gate first. With a cold gaze, Esparta asked him how he would reinforce the gate. Dono, standing nearby, suggested he help pile stones around the gate, but Van, with a displeased expression, replied that he would use creative magic. Van was a little annoyed, so he went straight to the village gate. Standing before the wooden gate, Van concentrated, raised his hand, and began to imagine. He envisioned a sturdy, solid gate, made of strong, unbreakable materials, a gate that could withstand any challenge. Instantly, the wooden gate transformed into a beautiful yet incredibly sturdy and solid structure. Everyone who witnessed Van's magic was amazed. Van immediately ordered Orto to attack the newly created gate to test its durability. He instructed Orto to attack as hard as possible so that Van could assess the sturdiness of the village's defensive gate. As soon as he received the order, Orto immediately took action, using all his strength to strike the gate. Each blow was powerful, delivered with no mercy. But Orto was astonished to see that the gate hadn't changed at all. Only a few minor scratches appeared. Van saw this scene and realized that wood wasn't the best material. However, adventurers like Orto found it strange, because the material Van used was already very sturdy. Van accepted all the compliments and he just smiled proudly. The next morning, Van woke up in the carriage. Van slept on a small bed barely big enough for his body, leaving him aching all over. He couldn't bathe or change clothes, having lived in the carriage for so long. Even before they arrived, he had to sleep in the carriage. Sometimes he gets to the point where he forgets that he's still just a normal teenager. Early that morning, Van was greeted by Kamshin and Till, who had been tidying up around the carriage. Van noticed that neither of them seemed tired, even though their condition was worse than his own. Van thought that this situation couldn't continue much longer. He immediately decided that he had to improve living conditions in the village, from clothing and food to shelter, and of course, strengthening the village's defenses. Finally, Van decided to build a new house and immediately ordered Kamshin to bring the timber blocks. After gathering the blocks of wood, Van placed them in the middle of the village. The village chief, Rhonda, came and asked Van about the purpose of collecting the wood. Van immediately expressed his intention to build a house on the vacant plot of land. At the same time, Van quickly asked the village chief for permission to erect the house there. The village chief understood, as this was quite normal for a landowning nobleman, and the vacant plot of land in the middle of the village had never been used before. Van smiled after receiving the village chief's approval. Immediately, he cast a powerful spell on the pile of wood. He thought that one day he would organize festivals and carnivals. Van focused and envisioned the house he wanted to build for himself and his followers. Van successfully created a solid foundation for the house, with 4 surrounding walls. Additionally, he envisioned thin wires being driven deep into the ground to reinforce the foundation. Next, Van built the walls and roof and finally the interior of the house. Van used all the wood he had, enough to create all the items and furniture for the house. He also created a dining room and a toilet as shared amenities, with a large bedroom and a medium-sized bedroom serving as the master bedroom. Then, Van created 2 more small rooms. As for the windows, Van made them without glass because he couldn't find silica. Not long after, Van completed a house that looked very luxurious. Esparta looked around and remarked that Van's house was still small, even though it was the largest house in the village. Kamshin and Till were incredibly impressed when Van's self-built house was completed. Kamshin even claimed that Van's creative magic surpassed that of the 4 elements. This statement surprised Till and Esparta. Van gently shook his head, explaining that although his magic was amazing, offensive magic was what truly mattered in protecting territory. According to Van, those who possessed elemental magic would certainly be safer as lords. However, Till disagreed with Van's point of view. She believed that living in Van's town would be far better than living in Lord Jalpa's town. Esparta then spoke up, agreeing with Van that it was true during wartime. But if there is no threat, then the main task of a lord is to improve the quality of life for his people. In everyone's eyes, no one could match Van's abilities. In the midst of the discussion, in front of the newly built house, the villagers, Orto, and the mercenaries all came to admire the structure with amazement. Van said he had just created the house using creative magic. This surprised Dee and the guards. Van went on to say that he would build houses for anyone who brought him wood. With eyes full of ambition and enthusiasm, Dono immediately ordered the guards to gather as much wood as possible. They hurried towards the forest. Van was taken aback by the guards' unexpected enthusiasm. The mercenaries, however, didn't want to be outdone. Orto immediately ordered his friends to gather as much wood as possible, and then the villagers also approached Van. The villagers also began to take an interest in Van's activities. They complained of Van that their houses were no longer habitable and asked him to renovate them. Van couldn't refuse because his work had suddenly become very tiring. He noticed that the people's houses were indeed in a bad state. Van then asked everyone to line up, promising to build new houses for them all. The people cheered with joy. Van thought that if his creative magic could make people happy, of course he would do it. Everyone started moving. Esparta and the villagers built defensive walls, Orto and his companions gathered wood, and Van led Till and Comshin to build houses. Van was used to jobs like this. Van worked quickly, even though he really wanted to spend his time making furniture for his own house. But the constant requests for help from the locals reminded Van of the time when he was an office worker, working non-stop. However, having started, he couldn't stop. While Van was working, shipments of wood from local people came in, impressing them with his ability to create amazing houses. Van then explained how he planned the city for the village. He placed his house in the center, while Dono's and the village chief's houses were situated in the two adjacent corners. Orto's team, who frequently came and went, was positioned near the gate. In fact, the four houses were combined into a single block, with the main street surrounding the outer area, forming a square. Van built houses for the villagers fairly, all the same. He did this for the time being and would renovate them later when he had enough materials. In any case, the villagers greatly appreciated his kindness. Gradually, Van became highly respected in their eyes, and they regularly brought him produce from their gardens. Van also built a simple bathroom right next to his house. Till and Comshin were both very pleased with the construction. To get hot water, Puriel used magic to fill a basin with water and a traditional fireplace to heat the water. Once the hot water was ready, Till invited Van to take a bath with him. Of course, Van refused because he was a man. Although he was only 8 years old, his mentality was like that of a 30-year-old man. After showering, ending a tiring day, they continued with Van's cleaning duties. Then, Van went into his new house and into the bedroom. Van was surprised to find his room still empty. Because she was so busy with other work, Van forgot to furnish her bedroom. He immediately set about making beds for everyone, and simple straw beds for the villagers. Once everything was done, Van was finally able to get a good night's sleep. The next morning, Till prepared breakfast for Van. He felt very happy because it had been a long time since he had had a good night's sleep. That morning was truly pleasant for Van, as he got to enjoy a delicious breakfast right in his own home. Next to Till, while they were having breakfast, Orto, who was also eating with them, said that protecting the village was very important. But according to Esparta, they also needed to address the issue of income, because in the current situation, the only way to communicate with the outside world was through merchants who came to their village once a month. Upon hearing this, Van had to confront his reality as a lord. He still felt very confused about how to solve this problem. Van thought they could prepare their belongings and clothes, and food shouldn't be a big issue. Therefore, according to Van, they should at least focus on strengthening their defense. Esparta then said that they didn't have the spices or enough ingredients to make Van's favorite sweet dish. Van was very surprised to hear this fact. He realized that he needed to come up with ideas to increase his income, which meant producing products to sell. At that point, Comshin came up with a good idea. They could sell the wooden blocks that Van had created. However, the idea of selling the blocks was immediately rejected by Van, as only he could create them. Till then suggested hunting monsters to gather the materials, but Van also refused as this task had already been undertaken by Orto and the other explorers. Esparta came up with the idea of growing trees and agricultural products. But this is very difficult and does not yield quick profits, due to the characteristics of the village. While having breakfast, Van and his assistants were thinking about ways to increase the village's income. After breakfast, outside, Van, Till, and Comshin, along with Kusar, a member of Ortho's team, checked the items. And Dono said that everyone really liked Van here. They checked the items to see the condition of the weapons that would be given to Van. Dono personally tested the power of the Orkmite shield. The Orkmite shield is crafted from the skin of an orc's back and shoulders, combined with strong and flexible materials. Then, Comshin took the sword Van had given him and swung it towards the shield. The swing seemed very weak, making Dono feel uncomfortable. But no one expected that Comshin's weak swing could split the Orkmite shield in two. This scene left all those who witnessed it stunned. Even Kushar couldn't believe his eyes because the shield was brand new. Van couldn't believe the power of the wooden sword either, and his words only added to Kushar's confusion. Seeing this, Van quickly used magic to repair Kusar's shield. The shield was finally repaired to like-new condition. Not long after, Ordo returned to the village. Ordo carried a large quantity of mineral ore. He wants to sell these ores to the villagers. Ordo said that at the end of the mountain range, at the foot of Wolfsburg, there were many powerful monsters. And thanks to these monsters, they were able to gather valuable materials without having to go deep into the mountains. Van and the hunters collected all sorts of different ores. It includes iron ore, copper ore, and a small amount of silver and gold. Then, Ordo brought out his most valuable ore, and Van immediately recognized it as mithril ore. Van was thrilled to see this extremely rare material. He then asked why no one had mined this type of ore before, and Ordo explained that it was because the area was very remote and complex, and only a few people dared to explore it. This made herbs and mineral ores unattractive to them. Hearing this, Van agreed because it made sense. Only a lucky few hunters could obtain them. If that's the case, the foothills must contain many valuable resources. Van then used magic to extract the ores that Ordo and his friends had collected. He separated the iron-containing minerals and sand, breaking down the iron ore and separating it from the sand. Normally, this process would require pre-melting to remove impurities, but this time it wasn't necessary. Kushar was thrilled to see this, and he wanted Van to make him a sword. Seeing Kushar acting unusually, Ordo became curious. Van decided to make weapons for all the hunters. Upon hearing this, Kushar requested a long sword and a short sword. Van used his magic to create an iron sword with a dense structure and the sharpest blade possible. He decided to make his first sword really sturdy. It didn't take long for the sword to be finished. Van immediately gave the first sword to Kushar, much to his delight. Then Van created another sword. This time it was a long but elegant sword. Before long, the sharp and powerful sword was finished. Van gave the sword to Kushar, and Kushar was even more delighted. His joy reached the ears of Ordo and his fellow hunters. Ordo and his friends rushed over and asked Van to make them more swords. Van readily agreed, continuing to create new swords for them. Upon seeing the exceptional quality of these swords, Puriel felt they were of great value. At this point, Esparta approached Van. Although Esparta had heard of iron sand before, but discovering this type of ore in the nearby forest is extremely rare. Esparta felt that if there really was a labyrinth nearby, then the likelihood of stone or iron golems existing there was very high. These golems could naturally produce ore, which is why they were able to find metal ore in the forest, something very rare. After thinking for a while, Esparta asked the hunters if they had found any trace of the golem, but they all answered no. So it can be inferred that the golem was destroyed beforehand, before they could even realize it. The hunters also didn't know if there was a labyrinth surrounding the village because the area hadn't been thoroughly surveyed. There might actually be a labyrinth somewhere nearby. This will completely change the situation of the village according to Esparta. Many people will come here, and this could open up great opportunities for the village's development. Hearing that, Van smiled gently. He knew that his next goal was to find a new labyrinth, one that could completely change the situation of the village and boost its development. Labyrinths are a paradise, teeming with resources and treasures. Many of the country's most valuable weapons, jewelry, and artifacts were obtained from these labyrinths. Therefore, labyrinths play an extremely important role. Hunters and adventurers must report to the guild if they discover a new labyrinth. There is a rule that when the guild receives notification of a new labyrinth, they will immediately open a branch in the nearest city or village. Discovering a new labyrinth is a great achievement for explorers and a fantastic opportunity to build a reputation in the exploration world. And to join the ranks of the best explorers, they will have the first access to explore new labyrinths. Van thought that if the village submitted a report about the labyrinth at this point, it would belong to the expedition. Esparta agreed with Vaughn's words as he believed the village would become bustling with adventurers, merchants, and even knights. However, in the current situation, they were running out of food and other supplies. Ordo argued that it was possible neighboring countries would attack, and it was highly likely that Count Ferdinand would be the first to attack. Therefore, in his opinion, there was no need to search for a new labyrinth. Imperial chimed in, saying that if they knew about the labyrinth, they would immediately send troops there. Puriel added that with Van's magic, the construction problems would be solved quickly. Van then said that he was just a burden to Ferdio's family. According to Van, they would soon get rid of him if they had the chance. so the priority was to expand and develop the village before making any pronouncements about the labyrinth. At that point, Fertio's family would be powerless to do anything. Upon hearing this, Ordo suggested narrowing down the area where the labyrinth might be located, or avoiding it altogether and focusing on gathering supplies. All the adventurers agreed with Orto's suggestion. Van thought it would be pointless to make a declaration about the labyrinth right now, because labyrinths are as important as nobles. Van's family still considered him a burden and had no expectations of him. If they were to claim the labyrinth now, Van's brothers would surely seize it. Therefore, Van must use his power to prevent anyone from taking over this village. Van then went off to handle other business, accompanied by Till. Van said that the situation with the houses was fine, but the next problem was finances and defense. Smiling, Till said that Van had built many houses for the villagers and thought Van must have a lot of magical power. Van replied that he still felt tired and wanted everything finished quickly. Kamshin thought they needed workers now, but only a few villagers were capable of doing the job. Van also wanted to stock up on shields and weapons before the merchants arrived, as defense was crucial. At this point, when the outer wall was almost complete, Van had plenty of stone and used his magical powers to create walls as hard as concrete. The walls were low and thin, but Van overcame the problem. On these walls, Van placed simple catapults, also created by his magic. In front of the catapults were shields. They can fire their guns without worrying about counterattacks. Van had towers built around the village and placed many catapults on them. After finishing setting up the catapults on the wall, Van called Kamshin to prepare dinner. Soon after, Kamshin appeared with a gloomy expression. He only brought back a few stones, feeling useless for not having done more. Van reassured him, saying it was the responsibility of a lord. Then Van asked Kamshin about his goals. Kamshin hesitated, then replied that his goal was to protect Van. Van was surprised, but he accepted that answer and reminded Kamshin not to overreact. Van perceived Kamshin as a straightforward person who always cared about others. He thought that one day he would make armor for Kamshin, because Kamshin had worked so hard. Van built protective walls and installed numerous catapults, making the village look like a small fortress. Looking at the results of the hard work, it's clear that the robbers would have had a hard time breaking in. Dono said that if Jalpa realized Van's strength, the ducal family will certainly grow rapidly. These words were interrupted by Espada, who believed that only the ability to fight was of utmost importance to the head of the family. Dono replied that if Van were given more time, he would certainly become stronger, so that this strength could be used immediately in battles. Dono and Espada debated Van's rightful place in the team. Van silently watched them. Then he said that complaining about fate or ability wouldn't change anything. Silence fell, and Dono paused when he heard Van speak. Then Dono burst out laughing, admitting that Van's words were absolutely right. Dono felt that complaining about bad luck wouldn't change anything, so instead they needed to work even harder. The atmosphere returned to normal, and Van encouraged everyone to get back to work. The ditches have been dug, but there is still no water in them. These ditches are crucial for defense, and water plays a vital role in the village's life. Therefore, Van needs to find a way to bring water in. While thinking, Van realized that the water source needed to be protected immediately. Suddenly, a shout rang out, announcing that the robbers were coming. Someone reported that they would attack from the dead-end street behind. Van ordered everyone to quickly retreat behind the city walls. In a panic, he demanded that the bridge be raised and the gates closed immediately. Then Van checked to see if anyone else was outside. He was surprised that just a few days earlier, the villagers had obeyed orders without a word of resistance. Yet now, outsiders were still fighting in fear. Although he was worried, as a lord, Van could not show his fear. He reassured the villagers that the village was now stronger than ever. And Dono and Espada are also here. Van's courageous words immediately ignited a fighting spirit in the villagers. They shouted without a trace of fear, ready to stand up and fight for the future of their village. Seeing this, Van smiled and thanked the villagers for their bravery. Van ordered the villagers to climb the towers to prepare the catapults. He ran up to the tower with the villagers, but suddenly Till grabbed his arm. Van told Till to leave immediately, which made Till burst into tears. Seeing this, Van understood Till's feelings. He immediately ordered Dono to lead his troops to investigate the enemy's plan, while he himself would sneak in behind the lines to take action. With enthusiasm, Dono readily agreed to Van's order. Van knew that assigning the task to Dono was the right decision, because Dono is a brilliant and outstanding leader. With his ability and confidence, Dono believed he could lead the army better than any traditional commander. He was ready to serve and sacrifice for them. Dono then ordered the villagers to begin their operation. With his passion still burning brightly, Dono watched the approaching robbers from a distance. From a distance, they could be seen running, numbering between 50 and 100. Dono immediately ordered Van to prepare his defenses as they approached. However, Dono noticed that the robbers were running very strangely, as if someone was chasing them. A villager looked from a distance and noticed their tails. It turned out the robbers were being pursued by two armored dragons. The people who witnessed this scene panicked, but they tried to remain calm. Dono realized that even seasoned warriors would struggle when facing dragons. He immediately signaled Van, informing him of the situation. The two dragons were chasing the bandits and heading straight towards the village. While attacking them with conventional weapons was impossible, Dono thought that magic might be an effective solution, but only Esparta and Puriel can use magic. However, Puriel is not in the village because she is out searching for ingredients. Even without mages, the knight army could still do it. They could defeat the dragons by restricting their movement and attacking their weak points like their bellies, but the villagers couldn't do this. They wouldn't be able to withstand the dragon's tail and claw attacks, therefore the villagers couldn't stop them. At this point, Van shouted, demanding that the name of the catapult's arrows be changed to iron arrows. Dono thought that dragon scales were difficult to penetrate, and that this might be pointless. However, he quickly realized the situation and, following Van's orders, signaled the villagers to prepare. Who would operate the catapults to maintain composure? Meanwhile, the bandits and the two dragons were getting closer and closer to the village. The dragons were so huge that they covered the ground as they moved through. This was unstoppable in a small village. Dono went on to report that the dragons were up to 40 meters long, and their speed wasn't a major issue as they were chasing the robbers. Van asked if there was another way, because he felt sorry for the robbers. Dono laughed, saying he had been swept away by his emotions. It turned out that Dono's laughter was his way of coping with panic under pressure, so he had to calm himself down. According to Dono, using excessive force would backfire. He then decided to let the robbers in and deal with them himself. Meanwhile, Dono ordered the villagers to attack the dragons. As the dragons approached the ditch, the villagers' trembling hands began aiming their catapults at them. Dono told them not to worry too much and instructed them to aim for the dragon's eyes or mouth, giving them time until the adventurers returned. Dono reassured the villagers that they would be all right, and that after this battle everything would be over. With a booming voice, he ordered everyone to prepare to attack the dragons. The dragons chasing the bandits were getting closer to the village. When the bandits reached the ditch, they immediately jumped across, narrowly avoiding being devoured by the dragons. Dono gave the signal to fire. After the order was given, the villagers immediately launched arrows from their catapults. At the same time, arrows rained down relentlessly on the dragons. The number of arrows fired was incredibly dense. The arrows flew swiftly towards the bodies of the dragons. Initially, they didn't seem to be affected much, but strangely enough, the arrow pierced through the dragon's body, even embedding itself deep into the ground. Down below, a villager inquired about the situation regarding the battle with the dragon. Dono replied that they had taken down at least 10 armored dragons in one attack. Dono went on to say that they had run out of arrows. Immediately, the villagers at the foot of the tower rushed to fetch more arrows. Meanwhile, Van remembered his very strong material and suggested using wooden arrowheads. The villagers were initially surprised, but they immediately followed Van's instructions. The archers quickly attached wooden arrows to their weapons. Although still apprehensive, the villagers seemed more confident after the initial attack. When preparations for the second attack were complete, they felt almost certain that this attack would be more accurate than the first. With a loud shout, Dono declared he would prove the strength of his village. After the second wave of attacks was launched targeting the dragons, Dono was astonished to see that the wooden arrows could pierce the dragon's thick scales. At this point, Dono believed they could accomplish the task without iron arrows. Dono immediately ordered everyone to use wooden arrows. Then, Dono quickly gave orders to the catapult operators. After a tense battle, finally they defeated all the dragons. Dono was overjoyed, reporting that they had destroyed all the dragons. The villagers at the foot of the tower also celebrated the victory together. Dono felt incredibly grateful that the enemy had been defeated without anyone being injured or killed. They only needed at least 60 arrows. Muttering to himself, Dono wondered what would happen if he told Commander Stradale about this. He won't believe it. He found it hard to imagine that, thanks to Van's cooperation and leadership, they had succeeded. Dono then shouted to Van to celebrate the victory. Van approached Dono and thanked him for his hard work. Later, Van climbed the tower and saw the dead dragons. Muttering to himself, he wondered what kind of dinosaurs had attacked their village. There were more than 44 of these creatures. Dono burst out laughing because he had never heard the word dinosaur before. He also thanked Van for all the success, thanks to his homemade weapon. Dono never imagined that simple wooden arrows could pierce the thick scales of a dragon. Patting Van on the back, Dono said that all this success was thanks to Van's homemade weapon. Van then looked into the ditch and saw at least 30 robbers still alive. The robbers were trembling, their faces pale, when Dono threw down the rope and ordered them to tie themselves together. Dono also threatened them, warning them not to cause trouble or face the wrath of the villagers. The robbers, filled with fear, had no choice but to obey in the pit, weeping and begging for forgiveness, promising to mend their ways. They did not want to become slaves or be imprisoned. Instead, the bandits volunteered to work for the villagers to atone for the crimes they had committed. The villagers fell silent, recalling the many times they had been harassed by them. A villager approached, shouting angrily at the robbers because they had killed his parents. In a state of turmoil, the people wanted to immediately attack the robbers. But Van stopped him, saying it wasn't worth getting his hands dirty because of them. Van asserted that the robbers would be punished when the knights of the kingdom came to take him away and let them work for the village until then. Those who were captured were tasked with separating the skin, bones, and flesh from the slain dragon. At the same time, the robbers had to extract the magic core from the monster. Meanwhile, Orto, having just returned from the forest, was surprised by the changes that had occurred. Van, standing beside him, could only smile. Kamshin then spoke up, saying that facing just one monster was already difficult. Puriel agreed, saying that many swords were still intact, and that no magic was needed to defeat the dragon. Although 30 men wielded swords perfectly crafted by Van, Puriel estimated they could only kill a maximum of 4 or 5 dragons. The following morning, Ordo joined in skinning the dragon while it was still fresh. The following day, people began processing the dragon's carcass to make use of every part. Meanwhile, Van changed the material of his knife to make it sharper. Finally, after 3 days, the work was completed. That night, the villagers, along with the guards, Orto and his family, celebrated the victory. While enjoying the meat of the dragon they had just defeated, Van stood up to give a speech, expressing his gratitude. Thanks to everyone's efforts, the village had now become strong and prosperous. People no longer have to worry about money and can use spices as they wish. Van then encouraged everyone to eat and drink freely, even allowing each person to have 2 cups of sake. The whole village raised their glasses to celebrate the victory. Applause and cheers echoed everywhere as they drank and ate to their heart's content. In the heart of the village, the atmosphere was joyful, filled with laughter. Van tasted the dragon meat and found it delicious, tender, and juicy. Orto explained that dragon meat is rich and flavorful because it's protected by a hard shell. Puriel also mentioned that if sold, dragon meat would fetch a very high price, and there's still plenty of surplus that could be sold. Orto later stated that the crossbow Van had built was just as powerful as the weapons they possessed. Dono and the guards approached Van to buy swords he had crafted. Dono wanted to buy a large sword and asked Van to make it for free because he was Van's loyal servant. Dono also wanted complete uniforms for the 3 of them. Hearing this, Orto also wanted a suit of armor made by Van for himself. Meanwhile, the villagers also approached Van to express their gratitude. Everyone looked very happy. Meanwhile, around the campfire, the village chief and his son sat drinking sake. They felt incredibly grateful that finally the day had arrived when they could gather, laugh, and enjoy delicious food, even for Van, a member of the nobility. The Espada then approached and said that it would be a problem if they considered themselves nobles, but that was also part of Van's greatness. Till remarked that it seemed Van would achieve even more extraordinary things in the future. While everyone was enjoying the ceremony and savoring the dragon meat skewers, Ordo mentioned that a complete dragon, including its shell, could sell for 30 gold coins. Van was surprised that the price could be so high. Ordo explained that because dragon meat spoils quickly, they couldn't sell it, and the shipping cost could amount to 8 gold coins for the rest of the dragon carcass. Van said that even so, they would still get at least 300 gold coins from the sale. Van paused, suddenly realizing that if this gold were converted into yen, it would be equivalent to 300 million yen. Espada then approached Van, who was lost in thought about the enormous sum of money. Espada said there was a rule that if a village or town received more than 100 gold coins, they had to pay a tax of about 50% to the nobility. Van was surprised to learn that they still had to pay taxes. He confirmed that they couldn't hide the money. Espada explained that it was impossible to conceal all of it, and it could easily be discovered. Van then became very gloomy upon learning that they only had 150 million left, and that the nobles would soon find out about the village's situation. Espada told Van there was no need to worry because he had a plan. Van realized that the Espada's loyalty to the nobility was unparalleled, and this time it was a completely different matter from the Labyrinth problem. This time, they had to conceal the truth. Therefore, they had to act discreetly, which would certainly be a betrayal of Van's father. Meanwhile, Van chose a peaceful path. He tried to calm down and asked Espada what plan he would use. Espada suggested informing her sister Mercia about the current situation in the village, so that she would become famous for defeating the dragon. Espada explained that this plan was a smart move because everyone would benefit. This relates to his family situation, where all the brothers are vying for the position of head of the family. Van personally wanted Mercia to be the head of the family because she had helped Van so much. Van subsequently agreed to Espada's proposal. The next morning, Van and his servants, Till and Kamshin, went through the market, and there Van was warmly welcomed by the villagers. Everyone in the village was delighted by Van's arrival. The scene of the villagers' enthusiastic welcome was lively, until one of them loudly asked permission to marry Till. Till felt very embarrassed when she heard that. She hadn't expected to be so famous in the village. Van, in the silence, suddenly took Till's hand. Till just smiled because it had been a long time since she'd felt Van's hand hold hers. She understood that Van wanted to attract attention. Deep down, although Van always presented himself as an adult in public, in reality he was still just an 8-year-old child physically. All the people who witnessed this scene smiled warmly at Van's actions. A moment later, Van let go of Till's hand, remembering that he was still a nobleman. For him, feelings were important, but honor was far more important. And Van also remembered that there would be a day when Till would suddenly leave him. Nevertheless, Van still considered Till's happiness to be his top priority. Van then spoke to Till, but before he could finish his sentence, Till interrupted, saying that all Till wanted now was to take care of Van. Therefore, he didn't think about such things. Till said that from now on she wanted to always be with Van. She took Van's hand again. A short while later, a tower guard shouted to Van that a group of people were approaching, and those were merchants from the capital named Lango and Bell. The tower guard said he had almost seen the dark figures from afar. Van was slightly surprised by the soldiers' keen observation. Van then ordered everyone to raise the gate and prepare their weapons, but the tower guard said they weren't robbers, so there was no need to prepare. Van explained that they needed to be cautious, wary of possible bandits around, so this action was necessary to protect the village. Van then immediately ordered Dono and Ordo to be summoned. Because there is still much to prepare, and it all depends on Van to take advantage of the opportunity, and now is the time to do so. Meanwhile, the caravan of merchants looked utterly desperate. Their wagons had broken down during the journey, rendering much of their cargo unusable. In addition, they had to pay for repairs, accommodation, and the cost of the escort. Furthermore, these merchants had not sold anything in the previous town, so they could not buy goods elsewhere. One of the guards spotted Anne's village fort in the distance, and it doesn't look like a village at all. Lango thought they might have taken the wrong road, but Bell said that was impossible. However, Bell recalled that the village was nothing special. Suddenly from above, Van's voice rang out, welcoming the merchants. Van introduced himself as the lord of this village. Then Van asked the arriving merchants to introduce themselves by name and the origin of their company. Furthermore, Van demanded that they state their names and positions. Lango and Bell immediately recognized Van, as they were businessmen based in the capital, and Van was the child prodigy of the aristocratic Marquis Furto family, the one everyone was talking about. Lango was astonished to learn that Van, not yet 10 years old, had become the lord of a remote village and instantly transformed it. Lango introduced himself as Mercia Lango's younger brother, along with a mercenary named Air, who was currently working as a bodyguard. Van then asked Orto if he knew these merchants. Orto replied that he was quite familiar with them. They had even drunk together before. Van then allowed Lango and Bell, along with their entourage, into their village. Bell and Lango's faces showed surprise as they witnessed the dramatic changes in the village. Here they were greeted by the village chief, whom Lango and Bell had known before. Shortly afterward, Van approached the group of merchants and introduced himself again. Lango and Bell bowed as a sign of respect for the nobleman. Van wasted no time, immediately asking if they could sell dragon shell parts. Bell became excited upon hearing this, as dragon skins are very rare items. Bell asked if they had ever defeated a dragon before. Lango and Bell were both excited, as they would soon make a lot of profit from it. Van then led the merchants to the warehouse. Bell and Lango were quite surprised to see such a large warehouse of dragon shells. Van explained that they had defeated at least 40 dragons and 30 bandits. Therefore, Van is now considering having someone move the goods. Van also said that their vehicle has been repaired. Bell was a little surprised. He thought they should call someone immediately to start trading as soon as possible. So, Bell promised Van he would move the goods within a month. Van understood and said they didn't need to do it immediately. The merchants could relax a bit in the village and enjoy some delicious dragon meat. Bell remembered that Van's dragon meat would spoil quickly if left for too long. Bell then suggested that Van sell it in a nearby village so that the dragon meat wouldn't spoil too quickly. Van asked about the nearby village, whether they could buy food there. Bell explained that the village used to be quite poor, so after paying taxes, they probably didn't have any money left to buy anything extra. Van said they would give away the meat for free. Bell was quite surprised by Van's offer. Van sensed that Bell's main purpose wasn't profit. Bell anxiously said that Van would save them, and now he was certain the rumors about Van being a child prodigy were true. Bell also said he would pay Van for the robbers. Van thanked Bell for the offer. Then Van made an offer that Bell couldn't refuse. High-quality body armor. Bell remained silent when he heard that. Bell wondered if there were any blacksmiths in the village. Hearing this, Van just smiled. And a little while later, Van showed Bell the high-quality armor he had promised. Bell became very excited the first time he saw it. Bell immediately recognized that the weapon Van was showing him was of extremely high quality. When Lango and Bell tested the durability of the swords and weapons by cutting into the dragon's shell, the shell was instantly torn apart like paper. Air, who also tried it, was very impressed with the quality of the weapons. Bell witnessed all of this and was very interested, deciding to buy the weapons Van offered at the agreed price. However, Bell couldn't take all the available swords. This wasn't a problem for Van, as Bell and the merchants could come back later. Afterward, they explored various places and areas within the village with Van's guidance. Bell, Lango, and Air seemed to thoroughly enjoy the tour. That evening, they enjoyed dishes made from dragon meat, and Bell was very impressed with the village. He then asked if they could come once a month. Bell could also negotiate with other trading groups to come twice a month. Van agreed to this proposal. Van also immediately increased the stockpile of food and sake. According to Van, just having food was enough to make the villagers happy. Van also wanted Bell to help promote the weapons. According to Van, if the two of them consistently engaged in the business of selling weapons, people would soon learn about their village. Therefore, if Bell could advertise, more weapons would be sold and profits would increase. However, Bell and Lango felt they didn't know how. Van then suggested opening a shop in the village. If they could negotiate with the big shop owners, merchants, or anyone else, it would certainly be much better. Bell and Lango were delighted to hear Van's proposal. Van had already prepared a house for Bell and Lango in the village to ensure a stable income. If they agree, this would save Van a lot of time, as he wouldn't have to negotiate with multiple merchants. In addition, the shop will be the first in the village, so this proposal will benefit both parties. Bell then said that he would be working at the village shop. Everything has been resolved satisfactorily and a good business deal has been struck. After the discussions and negotiations concluded, Lango and his mercenary companion left the village and immediately set off for the city to persuade the trade association to provide the village with workers and materials. They will bring the swords Van crafted, along with their dragon shells and magical cores to convince the association. Van also sends a letter to his sister Marcia to inform her of their achievements. Meanwhile, near the village entrance, a shop for Bell had been set up. Bell was surprised because they had only discussed the store design, but in just a few seconds, the store was already there. Van explained that the first floor was the shop, the second floor was the living area, and the warehouse was located underground. Van designed Bell's store almost exactly to her specifications, so that if any problems arose, Bell could report them immediately. With a slight tremor, Bell stepped into her new store, feeling quite pleased. The production of goods for Bell's store and the merchants would be completed within 2 weeks, so Bell's business was stable until then. After settling matters with the merchants, Van, along with Kamshin, Till, and the other bodyguards, set off for the river. Throughout the journey, Van was constantly asked if he was too tired to continue, but of course Van persevered and kept going. Meanwhile, Kamshin was tasked with clearing the road. With his sharp sword, Kamshin easily cut through any obstacle. Van was surprised by how easily Kamshin accomplished this. In reality, Van only wanted to show concern and kindness to people, but he couldn't maintain his strength. The journey from the village took an hour, and right in front of them was a beautiful river. Upon reaching the river area, they needed to fetch water, and when they arrived, Esparta used his magical powers to dig a ditch, easily bringing water into the village. Esparta can dig dozens of meters in a short amount of time. Meanwhile, Dono, Kamshin, and the others had to dig by hand. Van stood behind them to reinforce the foundations of the walls. Van felt that their strength was truly astonishing. On the other hand, Dono was very happy, laughing loudly as he dug the ditch, and his enthusiasm inspired the villagers, making them feel energetic as well. Although Dono was no longer young, Till found the job very difficult because the river was quite far from the village. However, Van said that if they didn't complete the work, they wouldn't survive. Van felt the job was indeed difficult, but when working together to achieve their goal, they could accomplish extraordinary things. Van thought that if the quality of life improved, people would be able to live better. Life would become better, and it would be easier for merchants and others who came here. That's why they had to do this work to live more comfortably in this village. After 8 hours of manual digging and the aid of magic, they finally found the village. This is truly an incredible achievement, as this kind of work would normally take at least a week. Kamshin asked why they had stopped working for the day, surprised because he thought they could reach the village in a few hours. However, Van thought it was better to stop, as he realized the other diggers couldn't continue any longer. Dono understood the situation and thought they had trained them properly, but overworking them wasn't good. Van then looked at Dono, who was still able to continue working, with a confused expression. According to Van, what Dono is doing seems quite foolish. The following day, they arrived at the village before noon. Throughout the day, they began channeling water to the village. Before controlling the water flow, Van gave a few brief instructions. First, Van expressed his deep gratitude to everyone who completed the work quickly. He said that he had witnessed the tremendous efforts of those who had followed his instructions, and he was extremely grateful for that. After speaking, Van immediately opened the sluice gate to direct water towards the village. The water began to flow strongly, carrying with it its power. Everyone was astonished to see the water rushing rapidly towards the village. Finally, the water reached the ditch surrounding the village, and the villagers rushed to the water. The village chief remarked that they could save a lot of time thanks to this work. With this, Van emphasized the necessity of water for drinking purposes. He also mentioned the need to filter and boil the water, so special equipment would be required. After a while, a villager who seemed very interested in what Van was about to create approached him. Van realized that this person really enjoyed the manufacturing process. He invited them to collaborate on creating magical items. So Van intends to create a water filter so that the water can be used immediately. This water filter will be made from wood, leaves, stones, earth, and cloth, placed in the middle of the canal that leads water into the village. The water flowing out from it will be collected in a steel tank. The necessary water will be drawn from a pipe connected under the tank and transferred to the boiling area. However, they still needed to find a way to create fire to boil the water. Till then suggested it would be easier if they had fire magic. Van understood and realized he needed to see Bell to ask if he had any in his shop. A little while later, Kamshin shouted that the water had filled up. It was clear that the ditch had been filled with water. Van asked Esparta if the ditch would flood if it rained. Esparta thought for a moment. In his opinion, it would all depend on the amount of water and why ditches were created in certain places. However, all of this required the added ingenuity of the Espada. Van then said that what he needed to do was ensure that the water could flow back into the river if the ditch overflowed or create a lake behind the village. Espada argued that returning the river to its source was a good idea, but creating a lake was even better. Espada believed that without the river's water, it would become a reservoir. Therefore, they have to plan carefully to ensure everything goes smoothly. After discussions with Espada, they finally created a 200-meter-wide lake right behind the village. This was an extremely important, urgent project, as it had to be completed before the rain in the next 3 days. The pond is almost finished. Actually, Van wants to create a smaller ditch, or something similar, but Van needs to think carefully about that first. Up until this point, Van had been satisfied, and the water reserves were still plentiful. However, an unexpected event occurred. In the morning, the villagers woke Van up in a panic while he was getting ready. Till said that the DEA and Espada were on their way to the area. Till said they were heading to Van's lake. Van was surprised. Van was surprised and a little embarrassed that his name was suddenly being used to name a lake. Till explained that the name was a way of honoring Van's efforts and preserving his legacy for future generations. Till also announced that the village had been renamed Van Village. Van felt strange and uncomfortable. He wasn't prepared for all these changes. After everything was ready, Van and his servants proceeded towards the lake. They walked past the back of the village to reach the lake, where a large number of villagers had gathered on the lakeshore. When Van arrived, he immediately asked what was going on. The villagers explained to Van that there was a creature hiding in the middle of the lake. Van didn't know exactly what kind of creature it was. They said there was a rumor coming from upstream that in the forest lived mythical creatures with perfectly green hair. A creature that is half human and half fish with strangely bright blue hair called Abgalu has appeared in the middle of the lake. This is a rare species that Van had never heard of, and only the Espada knew of its mystery. When Van called it, it didn't react at all. This made Kamshin think that perhaps it didn't understand. Deciding to bring some meat as bait, Van hoped it would pay attention. Sure enough, Abgalu slowly approached. This astonished the villagers. Meanwhile, Ordo and Dono remained vigilant. When Abgalu asked permission to eat, Van and everyone else were astonished, as they never expected it to be able to speak. However, that remark frightened the creature, causing it to back away. Van quickly apologized, and then Abgalu continued to approach, appearing as a mysterious yet captivating girl. With ears resembling fish fins, the creature appeared wary but still ate the meat and fruit that Van offered. Although it was always keeping an eye on Dono and Ordo, Van explained that this was dragon meat with scales, and if the creature wanted, he could dry it to eat later. The creature asked who had caught the dragon, and immediately everyone pointed toward Van, who had defeated the scaly dragon. Although Van felt he hadn't done much in the battle, merely accompanying the villagers and his bodyguards, but in the end he admitted he was the winner. The creature showed a momentary look of surprise, then recoiled. Then it disappeared as if swallowed by the earth. Everyone stood still, no one spoke, because everything happened so fast. The next morning, Till came to wake Van up because there was an emergency. Till told Van that there was news from the village about an attack, causing panic among the villagers. Van still feeling sleepy, Van tried to absorb the information. Till hurriedly helped Van get dressed and said that the enemy had taken over the water area. While preparing, Van asked if the enemy would retreat upon seeing their weapons. Despite feeling annoyed at being woken up, Van quickly made his way to the canal area. There, dozens of Abgalu people were waiting in the water. They showed no signs of attacking, they just stood still. This made the villagers hesitate, not daring to shoot. Van realized that these Abgalu people were the same species they had encountered the previous day. But this time it wasn't just children. There were men and women of various ages. They all looked very young. The Abgalu tribal leader approached and said he wanted to speak with Van. With his muscular build, he looked quite intimidating. Van agreed to let E go along. Bell explained that creatures like Abgalu often carry very rare items. Bell also said that many people believe that doing business with them will bring great profits. This made Bell very eager to participate in the deal. As Van approached a massive Abgalu man, this man revealed that his daughter, the same girl Abgalu met yesterday, was very grateful to Van for killing the dragon. The Abgalu people around were surprised and impressed upon hearing this. Later, their leader declared that he recognized Van as a brave man. And he agreed to the marriage between Van and Lada Priora, the girl she had chosen as her life partner. Van suddenly realized the situation and became panicked. He doesn't understand anything about this marriage. The Abgalu tribal leader explained that Lada, or rather Lada Priora, was his only daughter. She had a beautiful figure and would shine in the future. Van then asked where the first girl was. The leader pointed toward her and said she was playing with her friends. Van realized that she was still a child and immediately asked when this marriage plan had been decided. The Abgalu leader replied that they were an Abgalu people who had never interacted with humans. However, most recently, when the river became home to scaly dragons, it resulted in the deaths of many members of their tribe. Therefore, they needed to find a strong husband for their first daughter, someone who would save their people. Van concluded that the Abgalu tribe was looking for a strong man to protect them, and the only way they could think of was to have their princess marry that strong man. Van told the Abgalu tribal leader that his daughter should marry the man she loved, and he will protect them all, even without marriage. Abgalu, the leader, later said that they would remain in the area with his son-in-law. Van replied that they would be better off moving to the lake, where there was a bridge and other amenities, so that guests or intruders wouldn't surprise them. It was then that Van realized he had just been called son-in-law. Van was horrified and declared that he absolutely would not accept this marriage. From a distance, Lada, the first girl, shouted as if Van were her husband. This made Bell very happy. Bell realized that befriending the Abgalu tribe would bring him rare resources and immediately requested them. Espada said that Van was very fortunate to have befriended the Abgalu tribe, but he couldn't do anything if Van's first wife was Abgalu. Till, who seemed a little jealous, reluctantly accepted it as Van's choice, but concluded that Van didn't really accept the marriage, but couldn't refuse it either. Immediately, Van's artificial lake was transformed into a settlement for the Abgalu people. Seeing this scene, Van could only feel despair, because the lake was quickly filling up. Therefore, Van built 2 identical buildings on the lakeshore to serve as a recreational area. This is a place where the Abgalu people can sit for a long time because the roof is larger. Everyone in the village was delighted that the area was quickly becoming famous, and interaction between the villagers and the Abgalu people was going smoothly. They shared food and crops and exchanged gifts. Strengthening the friendship between the two sides, Van decided to build a new, stronger wall, large enough to protect the lake and enhance the safety of both the village and the people of Abgalu. Espada proposed building infrastructure within the city for long-term development. Van found his advice very reasonable. Espada also emphasized that if they were to build this wall, they needed to protect it securely, so he advised creating a structure large enough to serve and protect many people. Although the area would be smaller, Van decided to go ahead with it, thinking that life in the current village was good, and that more Abgalu people would move there. Furthermore, it would be better to have more villages, with tens of thousands of residents living there. However, Espada could not accept Van's view because it would take a lot of time to process. He added that this was something that needed careful consideration. Ultimately, Van sensed the rigidity in Espada's character, as even his own father had been unable to convince him. Espada went on to propose building each side of the wall at least 600 meters long, encompassing buildings, guard headquarters, and delegations. Van was surprised by its enormous size, and Espada said that the start date for the wall's construction would be set. Once they had enough people, all they could do now was lay the foundation for the wall so that it could be upgraded later. Van began thinking about the design of the fortress, a city that wasn't square. Espada stated that he did not accept circular cities because mages could easily penetrate their defenses by focusing on a single point, and that square cities were the most effective form of defense because they were easier to protect. Van wanted to create a star-shaped city, with the pointed corners he indicated as defensive zones to prevent easy enemy infiltration. Furthermore, the roads connected to the city walls but could be separated by individual bridges. Van then added that they needed to quickly attack from the corners before reaching the main section, because if they skipped attacking and tried to destroy the wall immediately, they would be attacked from 3 directions. This is a form of defense that has been employed on Earth. When muskets were created, Van thought that this strategy could still be applied in this world of swords and magic. Espada agreed, as attacking from the corners would prevent the attack from spreading to either side, which was crucial when they needed more players. Espada remarked that Van's proposed plan was very reasonable, impenetrable even to mages. Mages would have to attack seriously and destroy the walls until they were completely destroyed. During the discussion, a guard suddenly shouted that there was a message from Count Ferdinand. Another guard chimed in. It's not just the symbol of Count Ferdinand. It also features the unicorn and shield symbols that belong to him. Noble families are rising from the Count's faction. In addition, there were 3 carriages and about 100 soldiers accompanying them. Van confirmed that Count Ferdinand was indeed of noble lineage. Count Ferdinand, who previously owned the village, now wants to regain control. A troop of soldiers immediately advanced toward Van's village to verify the rumors about the child prodigy. Meanwhile, 4 powerful rickshaws with 2 girls. One is a child and the other is a young woman. They're about to arrive. The older woman stroked the little girl's head and said she would take care of her, but she also said they would soon meet the person who would be receiving them. At Van's house, he and his bodyguards were preparing to receive the messengers from the Count. Van felt a little overwhelmed by their unexpected arrival, while Till had tea ready. Meanwhile, Espada prepared the reception room for their esteemed guests. Once everything was ready, Van quickly invited the guests in. 2 women entered, one of them a little girl, but Van sensed that this girl was not an ordinary child. Van politely introduced himself as the estate manager. Then, an adult guest introduced himself. Her name is Panamera Carrera Cayan, and she has just been appointed as vice president. He was also a person of unknown origin, yet very powerful and wealthy. Then, the little girl introduced herself as Arut Anne Ferdinand, the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinand. She said that her father had sent her here because he had received news that a representative of Markets Ferdio was in the village. Van noticed they had sent their youngest daughter, and that Panamera was probably her guardian. Van also noticed Panamera's inquisitive gaze. This seemed very strange, but Van quickly diffused the atmosphere and politely invited the guest to sit down. He realized that Panamera was no ordinary person. She possessed a sharp and beautiful demeanor, yet was also incredibly strong. Panamera then spoke up, noting that Van looked younger than Arteju but was very calm. She went on to ask Van about the reason for their visit to the village. It turned out that this question didn't surprise Van, as he had anticipated it. The Count, having lost a portion of his territory, would undoubtedly be furious. But at the same time, he would also admire Markets. Van thought they might be afraid of Markets and could attack at any moment, so Panamera and her daughter were sent. Van responded calmly, stating that Panamera and Arut's presence was to gather information about the enemy and discuss agreements. Van's answer made Panamera laugh with satisfaction. She hadn't expected a child of only 10 years old to answer so accurately. Panamera went on to say that Ferdinand couldn't read Markets. Panamera went on to say that if people were looking for an influential successor, the name Van has consistently come up over the past 2 years. She also emphasized that if Van continued to attract attention, his magical abilities would no longer matter. While the opening ceremony was approaching, the Marquettes were still boasting about their wealth, and before that happened, they had already arrived. Panamera knew there were rumors that Van was a child prodigy, so the owner of this territory must have been very intelligent to develop it. Therefore, she knew Graf thought that Van would accept the Count's border and the Kingdom of Germany. However, Panamera also realized that Van had no ambition to take on a leadership position. Van remembered there was an order prohibiting nobles from fighting to the death. He was still confused by Panamera's words due to a lack of information, and Van later admitted that she was right in her observation about his lack of magical abilities of the four elements. This surprised Panamera, who was taken aback by Van's response. Panamera has once again confirmed whether the rumors about Van being a genius are true. Van replied that he did it all for his father. Panamera recalled that in the past this village only had a few hundred houses. But within just 1 or 2 months, defensive walls and structures built with materials never before seen were in place. She also realized that Van possessed powerful servants and talented knights. Currently, Van has 5,000 employees. Van was surprised to hear that. Panamera went on to say that technology enabling stealth military movement is a major threat to them. But Van went ahead with it even though he knew he would be caught. Panamera suspected Van had turned the border village into a military base, but Van immediately had to suppress a laugh. Seeing Van's attitude, Panamera became serious as she didn't find it amusing. Dean Comshin immediately stood guard, and the atmosphere became tense. But Van continued to laugh. Van asked Panamera to stop her delirious ramblings. He explained that he had only brought Comshin and a few belongings to the village. Van added that even his family had never visited, and had told him to quietly leave the city. Panamera and Arut were both surprised. She then asked Van where he got his friends and servants from. Dono replied that he followed Van because he was impressed by his policies and talent. Furthermore, Dono proudly stated he received a letter from headquarters asking him to return to the Knights, but he refused. Espada explained that he also followed Van because he wanted to retire and serve Van. Till added that although Van was a nobleman, he did not behave like a tyrant and promised to serve Van to the death. Van thanked them all for following him to this faraway place, because they wanted to be close to him. However, Panamera remained skeptical. Van then invited Arut and Panamera outside to assess the situation. At that very moment, Van was also preparing to begin rebuilding the wall. They quickly went outside where the soldiers led by Arut and Panamera were waiting. This sight surprised Van somewhat. Panamera immediately ordered his soldiers to line up, 5 meters apart. The villagers looked on in confusion, but Van remained indifferent to Panamera's defensive preparations. Then, Van instructed the villagers to make blocks of wood, and they began moving toward the construction of the new wall. Panamera was somewhat annoyed and asked Van about their purpose. Van knew perfectly well that Panamera was definitely thinking about a surprise attack. Upon arriving at the site where preparations were underway for the new wall construction, Van immediately began getting everything ready for the upcoming work. Van began the work of building the wall with the help of Espada, who uses earth magic. A tall wall was gradually being built. Panamera was surprised to discover that Espada had once been a user of the magic of the 4 elements. After the wall was finished, Van immediately went closer to inspect the material inside. He needs to know the exact proportions of materials needed to create the perfect concrete he wants. With his crafting magic, Van honed and strengthened the foundation of the wall using wooden beams and materials from the earth. Panamera and her soldiers were all surprised by Van's abilities. They were all curious about the magic Van used, and the Panamera is no exception. She looked at Van with an innocent smile. Van only possessed manufacturing magic to create objects, and he admitted that his magic wasn't even useful in his homeland. Van's words surprised and impressed Arut. It also brought back memories of her past. Her father was always busy. He didn't have time for her. Meanwhile, the mother remained indifferent, leaving Arut in the care of the babysitter. What Arut remembers most clearly is the feeling of uselessness. She was shy, meticulous, and not very good at learning, so there was nothing she could do. The only thing she can do is control puppets with magic. She cannot participate in physical activities such as dancing. But he is very good at controlling and moving puppets thanks to his abilities. Although there was nothing else she could do, this was the only thing that pleased her mother. Arut always awaited her parents' reaction, so she began practicing magic, dreaming of dancing with her puppets. However, it was all just wishful thinking. Arut was criticized and considered useless by his own parents. She was treated with contempt and criticism, leaving her confused about what she had done wrong. Gradually, she realized that her magic was worthless in high society. Even her mother stopped caring and visiting her, leaving Arut immersed in loneliness and despair. She lived with feelings of self-pity and regret for her own uselessness, and all she could do was cry in her sadness. It wasn't until she turned 10 that Arut was summoned by her father, this time with Panamera, a baroness of the Ferdinand family. She was summoned to the border area to negotiate with the landowners. Arut was still wondering about the woman who accompanied her. While Panamera was talking to her father, she then spoke to Arut, introducing herself in a gentle voice. Panamera inquired about Arut's marriage, but Arut had never actually heard of that. Panamera said that if the man they were about to meet was worthy, they could begin the marriage immediately. Arut honestly admitted that he was truly useless, so it was only logical to leave his family. Panamera gently corrected Arut's words, saying that Arut's brother had found a life partner, leaving only Arut. Meanwhile, Panamera affectionately stroked Arut's head and smiled gently, hoping Arut would find a good husband. Panamera's touch was both soft and firm, making Arut feel genuine care. Finally, she found someone who truly cared about her. The journey to the border village lasted 3 weeks, and for the first time in my life, Arut felt happy that Panamera was always kind to her, even though she sometimes annoyed her. Panamera was very determined and often got angry, but whenever Arut felt useless, her grandmother would come to comfort and hug her. Panamera would often pat Arut on the head when starting a conversation. And whenever Arut suddenly burst into tears, her grandmother would gently pat and comfort her. For the first time in his life, Arut felt true love. Although Panamera was always cheerful and playful, but before arriving at the village, Arut had decided she didn't want to get married. She just wanted to stay with Panamera forever. Therefore, she didn't want to get close to Van, only looking at him with a cold gaze. Although she knew he was special, he was completely different from what she had imagined. Van made a strong impression on Panamera, even though they had only just met. Van also has friends who respect him, even though Van is younger than Arut. But he has accomplished so much that he has earned everyone's respect. Arut realized that Van was a talented child. She felt very envious of Van, wondering why he was so lucky. However, Arut gradually realized that Van shared a similar fate to his own. Finally, Arut listened to Van's story and witnessed the miracles he performed with his magic, even though it had previously been considered useless. Arut's negative prejudices and jealousy gradually turned into curiosity. She thought she could do it too, and wanted to try, even if only a little. Returning to where Van was building the wall, Panamera remarked that Van had chosen a strategic location for his base, and she thought this was Marcos's territory. Van said his father didn't know about his strength. Panamera shook her head, saying that Van's father's actions were truly foolish. If they could harness Van's power, the territory would expand rapidly. Panamera never imagined that manufacturing magic could possess such power. Then, with a smile, Van said that he would continue building the wall tomorrow, and invited Panamera and Arut to stay to see the finished product. Afterward, they toured the village. Van said he had personally made all the interior furnishings in the village and the buildings. At this point, Panamera understood the misunderstanding between them. Panamera then explained their original purpose for visiting the village. The real purpose of the delegation from Count Fernand was for Van to marry Arut. Van was somewhat surprised to hear this, but Van immediately regained his composure. He explained that the occurrence of magical creatures was very high in this area. Therefore, he would continue building walls and developing defenses for the village. Van asserted that he did not need to marry for the sake of peace. Panamera doubted Van's words about the village continuing to grow, and her curiosity only grew. Panamera then explained that Arut was the girl she had taken care of since she was a child. From the very beginning, upon hearing Count Ferdinand's proposal for Arut's marriage, Panamera strongly opposed it. The Ferdinand family was hoping to forge a connection with Marcus's family through this marriage. It was a threat, and the partner from the Ferdinand family had to be younger, so they came to the border. Panamera said that with everything going on, it would make Arut unhappy. Van understood Panamera's words that if this marriage happened, Arut's fate would be uncertain. She could be abandoned without money or food. Panamera said that was the reason they were here. She had thought about many reasons and would not let Arut get married like that. Van understood Arut's silence and sadness. She wasn't ready to be ignored again. Van understood that because he himself had experienced that feeling. Panamera later said that she had changed her mind. Although she had considered Arut's happiness, Panamera accepted the proposal if Van married her. According to Panamera, Van is an ideal role model. She believes Van has clear and calm thinking, which is very different from most of her peers. Although Van was sent to the border, his followers stayed close to him, and he managed to change his unfortunate fate, discovering his own strength and intelligence. Furthermore, according to Panamera, Van possesses magical abilities beyond anyone's imagination. Panamera even said she would agree to marry Van if they were the same age. This made Van very happy because the woman he thought was cold and cruel admired him. After Van demonstrated his magic to Panamera and Arut, It was time for him to entertain his guests with dinner. Van started a conversation with Arut to initiate a dialogue. He asked Arut if he liked his dish. However, Arut was still shy and embarrassed, but she had to answer Van's question. Arut replied that she liked the meat and fruit salad that were served. Hearing this, Till, standing behind them, felt proud that she was the one who had cooked the meal. Arut still felt very anxious. She felt she had never spoken so much without a reason before, but Van didn't seem to mind at all. She still couldn't believe that someone as great as Panamera could understand Van's greatness. Arut thought she didn't deserve to meet someone as great as Van. However, Van interrupted Arut's thoughts again. This time he asked her about her hobbies. Arut replied that she liked pretty dolls. Van became very interested and asked if Arut could show him the dolls sometime. This surprised Arut. She realized that Van had a different, mature demeanor, even though he was younger than her. With a touch of embarrassment, Arut said she would show Van her favorite doll tomorrow. Van smiled and thanked Arut, which delighted her immensely. At that moment, Arut felt a strange sensation in his heart. It's a mix of happiness and sadness. Panamera glanced at Arut, making her feel extremely embarrassed, and her face turned red. Then Panamera talked to Arut for a while. However, Arut really wanted to talk to Van. Arut really wanted to start a conversation. But in the end, she couldn't get any information from him by the end of dinner. Afterward, everyone hurried back to their rooms. Panamera remained impressed by the peace and safety of the village, and she also thoroughly enjoyed the dinner party. Panamera was pleased to see that the villagers held Van in such high regard. Van proudly agreed that Till's food was truly delicious, and the village community was very friendly. Panamera was very impressed with the prosperity of the village. After a brief conversation, Panamera excused herself and returned to her room. Meanwhile, Arut remained silent, seemingly wanting to say something but unable to utter the words. Van waited for her to speak, but after 5 minutes, Arut finally bowed his head to thank Van for the thoughtful hospitality, and she admitted that she felt a little nervous knowing that Van might be the man she would marry. Then Arut hurried away, leaving Van with a flushed face. Arut felt embarrassed when he realized he had acted thoughtlessly. She hurried away after speaking too quickly, making the atmosphere awkward and uncomfortable. The overwhelming tension made Arut even more anxious as he wandered through the hallway. She was looking for her room. Fortunately, a guard escorted her all the way there. When Arut opened the door to the room, Arut was surprised to find Panamera in the room, wearing only underwear. Arut was stunned and embarrassed, not knowing what to do in the face of this scene. Panamera was not flustered. She approached Arut and gently offered advice. She said they could leave tomorrow as planned, or if they wished, they could stay a few more days. Arut nodded, feeling hesitant, her mind a jumble of confused thoughts. Panamera also offered to give some money as a thank you gift. Arut quickly prepared for bed, but deep down she really wanted to talk to Van, even though she didn't know where to begin. While trying to fall asleep, Arut couldn't help but look forward to tomorrow. The following morning, Van prepared to supervise the construction of the wall. Before construction began, Van cautioned the villagers to be careful because the project was on a large scale. In this project, Van assigned Dono the responsibility of supplying materials. At the same time, Van felt a little uneasy seeing Orto watching them work. Orto explained that he was simply curious, and that it had been a long time since he'd seen the villagers standing so solemnly like soldiers. Orto also said that after finishing his task, he would go hunting monsters with the sword Van had given him. Hearing this, Van advised Orto to collect high-quality animal materials when hunting. Finally, Van reminded everyone to get ready for work and avoid injury, and promised to throw a BBQ party after the job was finished. When the work was finished, everyone became very excited and got straight to work. After delivering a captivating speech, Panamera approached Van and praised him for effectively boosting the morale of the people. Van replied that the people were not soldiers, so he had given them freedom. He also promised to reward those with the best performance to encourage them to work harder. Suddenly, Arut ran up. She was a little nervous and greeted Van, encouraging him about his work that day. She hesitantly asked if she could watch him work. Panamera also asked Van what he would do next. Van replied that he was taking care of the canals. He explained that water pipes run underground beneath every building, and they need to be regularly cleaned and drained to keep the system functioning properly. Van explained that if the water channels aren't cleaned, the water will become contaminated and a source of disease. In addition, these channels flow into underground caves and eventually return to the river. A little later, Van explained the cleaning mechanism to Panamera. Suddenly, the Abgalu appeared, saw Van working, and offered to help. Panamera and Arut were surprised to see the Abgalu appear, and Panamera asked why they were there. They explained that they now live here because Van gave them delicious food. Leda Priora, who also appeared, said that she was Van's wife. Panamera was surprised to hear Leda Priora's words, but Van immediately explained that it was just a misunderstanding. He said they weren't actually engaged yet and would explain this to Leda Priora's father. Hearing this, Leda Priora became slightly annoyed and turned back into the water. Seeing that, Van promised to give them some delicious fruit today. Following Van's instructions, Lada Priora resurfaced from the water. Van then asked the Abgalu people for help to pull the planks out of the water. This wasn't difficult for them, and they quickly covered and cleaned the ditch. Van said they had to do this several times a day. The Abgalu people said they could take care of the job, and Van thanked them profusely. Panamera was extremely surprised to see how easily Van could give orders to the Abgalu people, but Van explained that they did so only as a reason to stay there. Later, Van invited Erut and Panamera to visit the construction site of the castle wall. Finally, they arrived at the place where the wall had been built by the magic of the Espada. The work was completed quite quickly, as they had already reached a length of 30 meters. Espada reported to Van that the construction surface was very good, but creating the diagonal corners was proving difficult. Van then suggested drawing hexagonal lines on the ground. Without hesitation, Van ordered Espada to expedite the construction of the project. Espada immediately understood Van's instructions, proving himself to be an excellent servant. Van began drawing the diagonal angles, but had to be extremely careful not to damage the structure. Panamera approached Van and offered to help with drawing the hexagons and diagonals. Panamera could help by measuring distances with a string and connecting the lines to create an accurate diagram. Without hesitation, Panamera immediately set to work with Van in drawing the diagonal lines. Van saw Arut, the other person with nothing to do, and asked her if she was all right. Seeing Arut alone and looking bored, Van invited her to survey the castle walls. On the castle wall, Van showed Arut the special bow and arrows he had made. Arut was surprised and asked what it was. Van explained that it was a giant bow and arrow used to defend the city walls, and he wanted to demonstrate the capabilities of the catapult. Van didn't want to embarrass himself in front of a girl, so he didn't show too much confidence. A moment later, with Campson's help, Van shot an arrow into the empty space. It destroyed some areas on the surface. Everyone was surprised, especially Arut, who was witnessing the power of the catapult for the first time. She hadn't expected the catapult to be so powerful. Van explained that this catapult was much more powerful than a regular bow and arrow. The loud sound of the gunshot startled Panamera, and she quickly moved closer to the source of the sound. Van explained to Panamera that they were test-firing the newly installed catapult. The shot was so powerful that it surprised Panamera, and she was very surprised to see such a powerful catapult installed along the city wall. Van said there were about 100 catapults installed along the defensive wall, but he planned to install even more. Panamera was shocked to hear Van's words and immediately started asking all sorts of questions, as she felt it seemed impossible. Van remained silent and offered a faint smile, knowing full well she was being interrogated. He then explained that it was a military secret. Panamera still couldn't understand because the technology was so powerful. Without hesitation, Panamera asked for more details about the catapult, even offering to buy it at any price. With a smile, Van said he wouldn't sell it, but would provide details about the catapult if Panamera could prove he was on his side. Hearing Van's conditions, Panamera could only remain silent and couldn't stop marveling at what Van had done. She realized that building a village in such a remote place was truly extraordinary, and that all of that could be achieved through the magic of crafting. This could completely change current views on magic. Van has succeeded in gaining the trust of other races, and he was also able to make Arut, who was usually shy, more open. This made Panamera even more impressed with what Van had done. Panamera hadn't experienced any of this in a long time. After careful consideration and weighing all the circumstances, Panamera emphatically declared that she would form an alliance with Van. She would immediately send a letter to the kingdom's capital today and formalize the alliance in the usual manner in which a nation seeks assistance from its nobles. Furthermore, Panamera also swore to be a loyal friend of Van and pledged not to betray him. If she did, she would relinquish her noble title. Everyone was surprised, especially Van, because Panamera, who had just become a noblewoman and the lady of the land, had pledged to help Van. Van realized this would displease many nobles, but he also understood that it was a good start to connecting with them. With a bow of respect and full reverence, Van felt the power of this promise. Van accepted Panamera's offer. Panamera smiled, followed by her soldiers, who also bowed in greeting. After Van confirmed that he agreed to the offer, Panamera reiterated that this collaboration is very important. Panamera also promised to lend 100 of her soldiers for 2 weeks if Van provided a catapult. However, Panamera also warned that she would not forgive Van if he caused any harm. Van smiled and agreed, as he noticed that the Panamera soldiers were very well trained. Van felt that the Panamera soldiers could perform tasks that ordinary people could not. Panamera then inquired about the method of transport and the arrows for the catapults, as she thought the catapults were quite heavy. Panamera wanted to arrange for delivery. She also felt she could make the arrows herself. Kamshin then glanced at Till, and it seemed they were exchanging something with their eyes. Kamshin approached Panamera and offered to take at least 2 arrows made by Van, then showed her a sword that Van had recently given him. When Panamera first saw this sword, she was immediately intrigued. Kamshin explained that the sword had a powerful cutting force, but Panamera considered it unsuitable for fighting enemies wearing armor and shields. Kamshin then inquired about Panamera's sword, and she drew her own, a sword that has proven its durability in fierce battles. Panamera challenges Kamshin, saying that if her sword were to be cut in half, it would be a miracle. Kamshin immediately brandished his sword, and although Panamera felt nothing, she was surprised to find that her sword had been cut in half. The Panamera soldiers were surprised, and she realized that the metal in Kamshin's sword was indeed very special. The sword's material was truly remarkable, Van explained, adding that while it was made of iron, the manufacturing process was entirely different. Van went on to say that the crossbow's arrows were also made of the same material, and that they could even cut through 2 or 3 armored dragons. Everyone was stunned and frightened by what Van said. After a deep sigh, Panamera decided to buy Van's arrows. She felt very happy and grateful. Meanwhile, Arit was sitting and waiting when he was approached by a group of villagers who were celebrating and drinking, rejoicing that Arit would soon become Van's partner. Arut, who wasn't good at communicating, felt extremely panicked. Fortunately, Van arrived just in time to save her from that situation. He warned the group of villagers that if they continued to bother Arut, they would no longer be allowed to drink alcohol. Arit was a little scared, so she hurried closer to Van. Van immediately invited Arit to sit at the dining table. While eating, Van explained that the surveying and construction of the city wall were going well, and that the wall would be completed within a month. Arit then asked about the city wall along the main road, whether it was finished yet. Van explained that he would build all the walls. He said that not all the walls were built in the usual order and time frame. They said that building the kingdom's capital took 3 years, and subsequent projects also lasted several years. Normally, even with a large number of people, this work would still be very time-consuming. The main tasks were usually performed by prisoners of war, and Huda and most of the 4-element mages were sent to the battlefield. No one could use 4-element magic like a Sparta, who could work on walls every day. Therefore, even though it is possible to build walls from the ground, giant stones could still appear. Van explained that, for the time being, he wanted to build the walls to a certain extent before the Lengo merchants returned to the village. Arit then inquired about the merchants, asking if they posed any danger. Van smiled and replied that he just wanted to create the biggest surprise possible when they arrived. Meanwhile, a group of soldiers are running away. It seems they are being pursued by something. Back in the village, the collaboration between Panamera and Van is going smoothly. Panamera's followers were all highly capable and hardworking. Those who followed Panamera were involved in a variety of tasks, such as checking for errors after surveys, assisting villagers, and transporting materials. However, the construction of the city walls could not continue solely through the magic of the Espada after the materials were delivered, and Espada's work was complete. Van continued the work of building cannons on the city walls, and this process happens every day. After 2 weeks, the 2 city walls, forming a triangle near the railway, were completed. With the installation of cannons, including both conventional and twin-barreled types, the workload doubled compared to before, but the villagers' morale remained high. Panamera also supervised the construction, and she was very impressed with the rapid pace of development that Van had brought about. Van thanked Panamera for its crucial assistance in completing the main sections of the wall. With the arrival of many residents, merchants, and adventurers, they were able to begin the work of building houses. Panamera smiled and said that she still felt envious of Van, as her dream was to have her own territory. However, that dream was not yet a reality, as it required a great deal of money and time, and for a countess whose territory had just been conquered, it was almost impossible. After hearing Van's account of the possibility of borrowing territory, Panamera added that in the next battle she would seize another territory so she could continue to support Van. Suddenly, a very loud sound echoed from afar, accompanied by someone shouting orders for everyone to take cover. It turned out that the sound was coming from Orto and the other adventurers. The people are being chased by a giant dragon. This dragon is incredibly huge and terrifying, destroying everything in its path. Van and the villagers who witnessed the scene were all stunned and panicked. Ordo explained that he had previously managed to temporarily paralyze the dragon and escape, but now all they could do was run back to the village. In the midst of the panic, Van quickly realized the situation was extremely dangerous. He was still unsure if he could counterattack and fight such a powerful enemy. This time, Van didn't want to gamble the lives of the villagers in this battle. The guards quickly reported the situation and awaited orders to attack the dragon. They also rushed inside to protect themselves, while simultaneously preparing defensive tools such as crossbows. Van immediately ordered everyone to seek shelter inside the fortress. Van instructed the guards to close the gates immediately once everyone had entered. In a moment of utter panic, Panamera informed her troops that the enemy was a mid-level forest dragon, incapable of breathing fire. Panamera instructed his men to escort a route into the village along with 10 of his guards, and ordered others to climb the city walls and guard the gate. Aerith was facing such a dangerous situation for the first time, and all she could do was tremble with fear. Van understood that in situations like this, fear couldn't simply disappear. He approached Aerith and reassured her, telling her to calm down. Van assured Aerith that they would definitely defeat the dragon because they had Espada. With the magic of the 4 elements and an incredibly powerful catapult, Van was confident they would win. He also mentioned Panamera, who is very strong and will be an important support force in this battle. Van continued to reassure Aerith that they would protect her, and that victory was certain. Meanwhile, Aerith remained very frightened, but she told Van to be careful. Van instructed Till to take Aerith home so she wouldn't have to witness the dangerous fighting. Then the group of explorers continued running towards the village gate, but it seems they won't make it in time. Van ordered the catapults to be prepared, emphasizing that they must avoid hitting Ordo and his comrades. Van realized that fighting a flying enemy would be very difficult, especially if the dragon entered the village. He ordered his men to target the dragon's wings, attempting to prevent it from attacking from the air. While the retreat continued, Puriel, in a panic, shouted that she would save herself and abandon Orto. However, Orto couldn't leave his friend behind, so he immediately turned back to save Puriel, despite the danger from the approaching dragon. While Rosalie distracted the giant dragon, Puriel and Orto were saved from the attack. However, the dragon turned and chased Rosalie, causing him to flee for his life while Rosalie was still being pursued. The others in the adventure group hurried towards the fortress. Rosalie felt left behind. Meanwhile, Orto continued to urge Rosalie to run as fast as she could, believing she could escape the dragon. By the time the rest reached the gate, Van realized the opportunity had arrived and immediately ordered the artillery to fire. Before Rosalie was attacked by the dragon, Panamera also signaled to her troops, asserting that she could handle what remained. A precise shot rang out. This made Van realize Panamera's readiness for this decisive battle. A brave warrior stands ready for battle. Finally realizing that Panamera's prestigious title is no laughing matter, Panamera immediately unleashed a massive fire spell aimed at the red dragon. This made Van realize that Panamera was one of the most powerful users of the 4 elemental magic he had ever known. Panamera continued to unleash a barrage of fiery spells towards the giant dragon, making it groan in pain under the power of fire magic. Van witnessed firsthand the miraculous power of fire element magic. Create special effects in battle. However, the dragon has not yet been defeated. Panamera hurried towards the village to prepare for a counterattack, followed by her troops. She also ordered the defenders to leave the city walls as the dragon was getting closer. The wings of the red dragon were almost completely destroyed. Nevertheless, the dragon still charged through the city walls, and Van realized that it was actually very powerful. It surpasses the power of humankind. Dono saw the dragon was already on the city wall and hesitated, wondering whether he should buy time for everyone to escape. Van yelled at Dono that the dragon was no match for humans. Espada also walked coldly without a trace of fear towards the giant dragon. Espada appeared to be preparing to confront the dragon head-on. Van warned Espada to leave immediately, because this is a very dangerous place, but Espada did not listen. He remained silent. Espada calmly walked towards the dragon, paying no attention to Van. Van, annoyed, shouted that he wouldn't leave either if Espada didn't come along. Hearing this, Espada stopped, realizing the danger. Espada approached Van and promised to hold the dragon off for a while before leaving, then continued walking, feeling as if no one was paying attention. Van was furious at Espada's attitude. However, Espada turned away and continued towards the dragon. The dragon immediately flew straight towards the crowd. Espada quickly used earth magic to create a barrier wall of earth. This caused the dragon to charge into it. Espada seemed pleased that he had stopped the dragon, then slowly walked back towards the crowd. However, Van noticed this and felt confused because Espada was walking very slowly and calmly. In a panic, Van hastily urged Espada to move faster before the dragon could stand up. Espada replied that he was walking slowly due to his age and then helped him walk, while Van would lead the troops to prepare for a counterattack. Van quickly ran towards the inner defensive wall but felt he wouldn't be able to get back in time. Orto and his friends had reached their limit. From a distance, Panamera unexpectedly shouted that preparations for the counterattack were complete, because the second attack was ready. Van ordered the ballista catapults to get ready to fire. Panamera then asked Van if she could act independently. Van realized that Panamera was asking for direct instructions from him. Immediately, Van ordered Panamera to hold the dragon back. Before reaching the fortress, Panamera used magic to temporarily halt it, while the crossbows continued firing. She smiled with satisfaction after receiving orders from Van. This was the first time she had used magic to stop an enemy. Van simply said that it didn't matter because their enemy was a dragon. Immediately afterward, the giant dragon moved again and attacked. Van had to rush forward to protect Panamera and the others. While she gets ready, Dono and the other soldiers ran back with swords made by Van. Dono was full of confidence in his ability to win. Dono quickly rushed towards the dragon that was about to take flight. Dono swung his sword quickly, cut off the fingers on the dragon's feet. This caused the dragon pain. Meanwhile, the other soldiers swung their swords at the dragon. The dragon used its tail to deflect Dono's attacks and trip the soldiers. The dragon then ran towards Espada once again. Immediately, Espada used earth magic to create a shield. This caused the dragon to crash violently into the ground. Dono immediately ordered his soldiers to retreat, and they quickly ran to the back. Van was impressed by the soldiers who fought like heroes, especially Dono, the fastest of them all. The dragon got back up after being hit by Panamera's magic stone and continued to chase the soldiers. Van signaled to Panamera to immediately use fire magic to attack the dragon. Panamera immediately chanted a mantra. Fire spears struck the dragon. The attack was enough to slow the dragon's movements. Then Van signaled to fire ballista at the dragon. Ballista's shots were continuously aimed at the dragon. This time the dragon didn't have time to dodge. Due to the previous attacks, the dragon was clearly severely injured. Then Van ordered the remaining arrows to be fired. The dragon roared in agony, shocking everyone who heard it. Van saw that the dragon could still stand firm, despite being seriously injured. Van then ordered the next attack immediately. Van also ordered Dono to check on the dragon. Dono slowly approached the dragon, which could no longer stand. The dragon then tried to bite Dono, but Dono quickly dodged it, and Dono swung his sword at it. This caused the dragon to fall and die instantly. Everyone witnessed it, and now it's all over. Everyone cheered in celebration of the victory. Everyone's faces showed relief and joy because the threat from the dragon had been eliminated. Immediately after the battle, everyone returned to the village. Till and Orto anxiously asked Van how he was doing, but he just smiled and replied that he was only running with a spada bar. Meanwhile, Dono and two other warriors bravely held off the dragon. Till immediately told Van to rest. Van sat down, relieved that the battle was over. Panamera approached Van, praising his excellent command skills, and she congratulated him on his victory. Van replied that without the strong support from Panamera, Dono, and Espada, victory would certainly have been difficult to achieve. The dragon could have destroyed an entire city, something he couldn't have imagined. Panamera was very pleased that Van had been so honest. She said that if such a forest dragon were to attack the princess's territory, the city could have been destroyed. At least the city walls would have collapsed and hundreds of lives would have been lost. Panamera added, Espades and Dono will forever be remembered as heroes. Van agreed with Panamera's words, saying that all those who had helped deserved praise. However, Panamera raised an eyebrow in disapproval of the gunner for not being strong enough to defeat the dragon, prompting her to increase her power in order to deal with the dragon. After hearing Panamera's criticism, Van began to think about enhancing the gunner's power to make it stronger. Panamera smiled, agreed with the idea, and suggested they should acknowledge their achievement in defeating the dragon. First, Dono will be awarded the title of Dragon Hunter. As the village chief, Van will receive the title of Lord of War, while Espada will also be awarded another prize. After hearing this, Van fell silent, remembering that Dono would be awarded the title of Dragon Hunter. The next day, in a large field, Van stood before all the villagers and announced the award ceremony. He introduced the person who would present the award. That is Panamera Carrera Cyan, the head of the noble Cyan family. Everyone was amazed by the majestic and captivating presence of the Panamera. She immediately spoke up before the villagers, declaring that those who had slain the forest dragon were knights and mages who had worked tirelessly to protect the village. They successfully overcame a threat that could have destroyed the village and the fortress. Panamera also noted that, thanks to everyone's efforts, no one suffered any harm. Then she introduced the people who would be receiving the awards. First, she introduces Dono, a member of the noble Furtio family, who beheaded the forest dragon and played a significant role in the battle. Next, Panamera introduces Espada, a four-element mage who played a crucial role in paralyzing the dragon with her powerful magic. Finally, Panamera introduces Van Furtio, the fourth son of the noble Furtio family. She said that even though Van was only 8 years old, thanks to his knowledge, strategy, and intelligence, he built and defended the village exceptionally well. Panamera explained that Van had played a crucial role in the battle with the forest dragon, because it was his strategies as the village ruler that led them to victory. Everyone applauded after Panamera introduced Van as the third recipient of the award. Van just smiled shyly and waved to the villagers. The award ceremony ended, and immediately afterward, the festival began. Van brought out his sword for Panamera to see, and she was surprised by the quality and sharpness of the sword Van had made himself. Van just smiled and said that it was just an ordinary sword made from ordinary materials. However, Panamera was even more surprised that Van had created hundreds of such swords all by himself. With an innocent smile, Van said he could make a sword for Panamera for 5 gold coins. Panamera remained silent, once again feeling cheated by Van. This time, thanks to the support of the Panamera family and hundreds of powerful warriors, they quickly gathered enough materials. The warehouse immediately filled up, and so they had to build an underground storage facility. The construction remained unfinished until the wandering merchants returned. With their caravan, they used an armored lizard at the entrance. Lango was extremely surprised to see that the village they had visited before had been transformed into a large fortress. Bell told his brother that there was a more urgent situation. Suddenly, Van appeared from behind to greet the arriving merchants. Lango then reported to Van that he had secured support from the chief merchant guild, in addition to 5 large caravans and 3 medium-sized caravans. These merchants were also escorted by 4 other men besides Lango and supported by 20 men and 5 slaves. After receiving the report from Lango, Van invited Bell and Lango to the new warehouse. From the outside, the panicked shouts of the merchants could be heard as they watched the materials from the dragon inside the warehouse. The merchants Lango brought seemed unable to believe that they had captured a dragon. Bell explained to Van that the reason the merchants were shouting in panic was because the value of the dragon's raw materials, if sold in the capital, would be at least 100 platinum coins. Bell said that in this way, Van could earn at least 150 platinum coins. This means the dragon is worth nearly 10 billion yen. Bell explained that an auction would be held in the capital. This is where high-value items are sure to appear, and merchant guilds are sure to participate. Bell said that with such a rare item, it's no surprise the seller would ask for at least 150 platinum coins. Van then asked Bell and Lango whether they were making a large profit from shipping and sales. Bell explained that aristocratic families would often blame others if they weren't making a profit, but Van didn't care about that. The total profit from the customer could be between 3 and 5 platinum coins, and this deal made perfect sense for their business. Van thought for a moment and then said what they were doing. Just set up a trading company, Bell pondered, realizing that Van's words made a lot of sense. Suddenly, the 4 merchants that Lango brought arrived. They approached Van, smiling broadly. They said they could open branch stores in the village because they were members of Miri, the kingdom's largest merchant group. Van realized they were trying to convince him. Calmly, Van replied that the village's population was still too small. One of them immediately asserted that they were very trustworthy and would bring the best goods to sell in the village. Then, the bargaining between them and Van began. Sweet promises were made one after another by the merchants. Van understood that they were only interested in the outcome of this agreement, and once it was finalized, they would have little interest in the village anymore. Van was certain that the merchants would open a large store here, then cut their profit margins. They sold the village's valuable products to other cities at exorbitant prices. Van realized that these merchants had absolutely no commitment to the village. They only focus on profit. With a slight smile, Van said he would think more about their offer. They then begged Van to choose them as business partners instead of Bell and Lango. Van said that traders can manipulate commodity prices. The merchants immediately refuted Van's statement, arguing that 8 platinum coins was a reasonable price. Lango was surprised to hear that, saying that the dragon should be worth at least 100 platinum coins. Hearing Lango's words, the merchants began whispering their criticisms of him. According to the merchants, there is no guarantee that they will make a profit of 100 platinum coins. Bell then appeared to mediate, saying that as merchants, they had to settle things fairly. According to Bell, the selling price and shipping costs must be offset by the profit from the sale of the goods. Therefore, even if the auction ended at the initial price, the merchants could still make a large profit. Whispering amongst themselves, one of the merchants approached Bell and said that what he was saying made no sense. According to that merchant, almost no other merchants had come to the village throughout the past year. For him, 8 platinum coins was a reasonable price. Furthermore, according to the agreement, each member of the merchant group would receive at least 1 platinum coin. Even though they whispered to each other, Bell could hear every word clearly, and he firmly stated that they would not participate in such degrading actions. According to Bell, a trader's most important asset is trust, so when trading with anyone, they must always be honest. This will yield long-term profits. The merchant, feeling insulted that a young man was lecturing him about business, slammed his bag on the ground and walked away. After listening to everything, Van remained silent because he didn't understand much about merchants. Van then asked Bell and Lango if they were worried about losing business partners. Bell replied that it wasn't a problem, since they didn't know which group of merchants Bell and Lango belonged to anyway. Bell further explained that they were not interested in joining such groups of traders. They prefer to trade independently. Lango explained that by hiring security guards, they could get the goods to the capital and had to register the items with the association before the auction began. Bell then explained the 3 main conditions for participating in the auction. First, a large sum of money had to be borrowed from members of the Merchants Association. Secondly, they had to own the original shop. And thirdly, merchants needed support from the nobility. Van focused on the third condition, where the nobles had absolute legal power, and the founder of the trading company would be rewarded, while the nobles would reap profits without doing anything. After a moment of thought, Van asked about the price of the dragon and whether Lango and Bell would make a profit from each sale. Hearing Van's question, Bell immediately asked if he would be interested in partnering with them in business. Bell explained that, as Van had said, sales fees were necessary, but prices could vary depending on the market. Van nodded slightly, indicating understanding. After a while, Van asked the merry merchants which noble family they worked for. Bell turned his face slightly away, replying that they collaborated with valuable nobles. Hearing this, Van sensed it was a serious matter. When a trading company is established, there will certainly be introductions from high-ranking nobles to help the company grow stronger. Of course, if merchants treated their customers well, they would maintain their image and receive support from the nobility. But Van thought that trying to win the favor of the royal family was clearly a form of deception. Bell went on to explain that Mayari had shops in all the strategic locations throughout the country, which allowed them to sell rare materials and slaves acquired by the knights. The merchants always received guidance from the rulers. Lango added that the first founder of Mary is rumored to have been the lover of the ancestral king. Lango's words made Van feel that the situation was becoming increasingly serious. Other companies are always watching them, and if someone sets a trap to expose the truth, it's very likely everyone will turn against them. Van asked Bell and Lango about the Merchants Association's affiliations, as they must have connections with many large organizations, including those in other countries. Since their headquarters are located in another country, as long as all the conditions are met, they shouldn't have any problems. Bell confirmed Van's statement, saying they could absolutely build the shop and wouldn't have any financial difficulties. Van then added that regarding the aristocratic matter, he wouldn't use his family connections, because he realized that he had been abandoned by his biological father and his older brother was not a nobleman. Van could ask Panama for help in building relationships, because she was the only person in the aristocracy that Van could trust. This decision brought relief to Bell and Lango. Van approached Panamera, who was practicing with a sword. After explaining everything, Panamera immediately agreed to help Van. Van was quite surprised that Panamera so quickly accepted his offer. Panamera then said that she would not lose anything by becoming a noble patron of the Bell and Lango merchants. This might cause a stir in the kingdom, but they could force the kingdom to submit. Van thought this could indirectly anger the kingdom. Panamera explained that since she had no territory or knights, she could act in her own way to attract attention. Furthermore, this request would help enhance her prestige upon her return to the palace. Van realized this was a very good idea, as Panamera would receive all the praise upon entering the kingdom, and Van's family wouldn't mind. Panamera went on to explain that as soon as they entered the kingdom, all intelligence would be gathered, including the battles they had participated in. Therefore, concealing this incident would be pointless. Hearing this, Van was shocked. Van was worried that his father might call him home, even though he had begun to like life in the village. Panamera approached him and whispered that she had a good idea to help him survive. Panamera offered Van the title of a new nobleman and established an aristocratic family. However, Van realized that this idea was not easy at all. Panamera was very confident in Van, as he had just defeated a dragon. This could change the story of the slain dragon and make Van more prominent in the kingdom's eyes. Hearing this, Van felt confused and uneasy. Panamera reassured everyone that this was not a problem. Van wasn't sure if he could become a nobleman because he didn't know what his father would do. And I also don't know how my second and third brothers will react. Becoming a noble before his older brother could do so would certainly attract attention. Panamera explained that Van, with his dragon-slaying feat, had achieved a great accomplishment that would help him advance in society. Furthermore, Van will earn a lot of money from the joint venture companies, so it's all in his favor. Panamera recounts that when she first became a noblewoman, she also encountered many enemies who only wanted to take advantage of her, but Panamera wiped them all out. She added that Van could use catapults to deal with his enemies, making it impossible for anyone to confront him. Panamera said this while laughing with amusement. Van replied that if he accepted all the praise, Panamera would receive nothing. Panamera looked at Van with a sarcastic smile, saying that he didn't need to worry about it. Van looked into Panamera's sharp eyes and suddenly felt threatened and afraid. Panamera laughed with satisfaction after teasing Van, then said that she would make Van stronger. 2 days later, Belle resumed the negotiations to buy back the dragons from Van, and everything went very smoothly. Van also announced that Panamera had agreed to become a noble partner with them, on the condition that she would receive a share of the profits from all the businesses that Van built. Just as Lango was preparing to return to the kingdom's capital to sell the forest dragons and ironclad dragons as raw materials, he discovered that Miri's group of merchants had already left. They had left with their wagons. Belle said they could catch up with the convoy as it was moving quite slowly. Lango was puzzled, wondering why the group of merchants had returned empty-handed, which would surely raise questions from the Merchants Association. At that moment, Panamera appeared and said that the merchants would be anxiously waiting, and they would have to ask for help in transporting their goods. If that happened, they would have no choice but to obey and sell their goods. At a price of 80 platinum coins, Van felt the group of merchants seemed very cunning. Van then approached Lango and said that he could build a vehicle and transport the goods. Furthermore, Van could have Ortho escort Lango. Panamera then offered to act as a bodyguard and lead his troops to the capital. This plan needed to be executed to highlight Van's capabilities. Van was delighted and thanked Panamera for her kindness. Van's smile made Panamera blush. This came as quite a surprise to Van, as he hadn't expected to be able to confuse Panamera so much. Finally, Belle asked Van again to make sure everything was ready. Van remained cheerful and quickly prepared a large vehicle to transport the goods they would be bringing with them. Van built a giant car out of ultra-lightweight wooden blocks. Panamera also said that the carriage would be pulled by the horse she brought along. A swift and powerful military horse. Belle and Lango cheered enthusiastically throughout the trip. The merry merchants were on their way to the capital. One of the merchants said that if Van acted foolishly, it would only embarrass him. The merchant added that Belle and Lango would not receive the delivery truck. Suddenly, from the direction of the carriage the group of merchants were riding, a huge vehicle unexpectedly sped forward. The merchants began to panic and become frightened. They suspected that Van had sent the carriage, but that was impossible, as Van had been ostracized by his family. Moreover, this enormous vehicle doesn't resemble a luxury car at all. One of the merchants later noticed the flag attached to the cart, and that flag belonged to the noble Cayenne family. Then they saw Panamera riding gracefully on horseback past them. They also saw Lango in a horse-drawn carriage. This surprised them greatly as they saw Lango riding in that carriage and accompanied by a nobleman. The merchants couldn't believe their eyes because Belle and Lango were important figures in the Merchants Association, so it was impossible for them to receive help from the nobility. The merchants realized they would suffer heavy losses upon arriving in the capital. Because the delivery truck contained 40 items from Iron Dragon, they regretted not buying the Forest Dragon for 100 platinum, because that could have yielded a profit of 1 or 2 platinum coins. Confused, they didn't know what to do, whether to apologize and ask Lango to bring the rest of the merchants, but one of them objected. They suggested they should report Belle and Lango, because they were deceived. However, this proposal can only succeed if the association believes in it. Meanwhile, the story continues with an explanation of King Thano Anshora Belinet of the Scuderia Kingdom, who ascended the throne at the young age of 16. Despite this, he successfully reformed the army before turning 20. He surpassed the achievements of his predecessors, preventing betrayal, prioritizing talent over family ties, and replacing numerous commanders. King Dino reformed the entire officer corps below the rank of deputy commander, transforming them into powerful warriors, prioritizing strength in the military revolution he led. This required considerable time, effort, and even bloodshed. Nobles were required to serve as officers or deputy commanders, leading to many less capable noble children losing their opportunities. This caused noble families like the Feldinet Count's family to gradually lose influence. Meanwhile, families like the Feldinat increased their influence through a focus on the military. Nevertheless, the king still personally bestowed knighthoods upon deserving individuals and treated them well. Panamera arrived calmly to report to King Dino. Panamera came from a noble family in the capital. Upon discovering that Panamera could use magic, she was immediately placed in line to inherit the count's territory. Panamera's childhood was filled with rigorous training, and she had to sacrifice a great deal of her leisure time to learn. Through her tireless efforts, Panamera became a captain at the young age of 16. Success came to her, and her subsequent resounding victories led her to become the knight captain, leading her troops in fierce battles. In particular, she participated in the war against the Aeronetic Kingdom, and her army changed the course of the war. After her victory, she was knighted, and many admired her and offered to make her a knight. The king was pleased with her achievements and bestowed upon her a high title. 6 years later, Panamera stood firm before King Dino. She sat on the throne, her gaze sharp and powerful. The king thought she had come to request a higher title, but Panamera had other intentions. She wanted to bestow the title upon someone else. The king was surprised and asked about the person Panamera wished to recommend as knight. Panamera bowed her head and said that the person couldn't come because they couldn't find a replacement or representative. He was a feudal lord of the kingdom. King Dino then asked Panamera why she recommended Van. Was it for his future or for the potential and achievements he would attain? King Dino was surprised that someone of Panamera's reputation would praise Van. At the same time, the king was also curious about his achievements in a wild, uninhabited land lacking knights. Panamera calmly stated that Van had killed a dragon. The answer stunned the officials and guards in the throne room. They couldn't believe their ears. An official asked him if he possessed elemental magic. Panamera replied that Van did not possess that kind of magic, despite coming from a prominent family and having been ostracized by his own. The king's advisor, surprised, asked how that was possible. Meanwhile, the king, with a sharp gaze, also curiously asked who she was. Panamera then revealed the name of the person she wished to recommend. She confidently introduced Van Furio, the son of Marcus Furio, and claimed that he was the one who had killed the dragon. The king was surprised that Marcus had never reported this. Panamera explained that there were no reports, but she had spoken directly with Van and the villagers. She described the situation in the village, which had fewer than 100 people and had been attacked by bandits upon their arrival. However, Van defeated the bandits with the help of some mercenaries he hired. The king was utterly astonished to learn that a child could have won that battle. Panamera went on to say that Van also built an earthen wall and repaired damaged houses. The guards and nobles present in the throne room couldn't believe what Panamera said. She added that Van had slain the dragon with the strength of 100 villagers and a deputy captain in just 3 nights. Panamera insisted that Van had killed the dragon without suffering any loss of life. The king's advisor then asked Panamera if she had any evidence to support her claim. Panamera replied that she had brought the dragon carcass and 40 armored lizards as proof. The knights in the throne room and the kingdom's officials were all surprised by the news of Panamera, for even the most skilled knights could not have accomplished such a feat. However, Panamera found that her testimony was still not convincing enough for the king and the officials. Panamera then added that she had consulted the villagers, and they all confirmed the same story. The king's advisor whispered to the king that Panamera's words were highly suspicious. According to him, Panamera seemed to be letting others, especially a child, take credit for her work in order to claim all the praise. The advisor suspected that Panamera might be plotting to seize a new territory. However, King Dino had no suspicions about Panamera. He immediately questioned her about the truth of who had granted Van ownership of the territory. Panamera insisted that everything she said was true. The king then spoke, saying he would be staying for a few days, so Panamera didn't need to prolong the story. The king's advisor, standing beside him, reminded Panamera that if her words were untrue, her title of mayhood would be revoked. Panamera firmly agreed and demanded that the king witness the truth himself. However, with a smug smile, the advisor remained skeptical about Van's ability to transform the village in such a short time. Panamera replied that perhaps after meeting the king, Van would be given a new territory to defend the kingdom. Hearing this, the king smiled, showing deep interest in Van and a desire to meet him as soon as possible. Meanwhile, in the heart of the capital, the dragon head has just been brought to the city market. It left everyone stunned and amazed. A crowd gathered around Belle, where Belle felt overwhelmed by the curious stares of everyone. Suddenly, Panamera, after leaving the throne room, she shouted and announced that Van had become a count, and his reward for killing the dragon will be decided later. The residents of the capital were surprised to hear this news and immediately began buzzing about Van. who had successfully killed the dragon. Panamera then approached Belle and Lango to negotiate with the alliance. She also took the opportunity to ask about the name of the business they would be establishing. Lango then named it Lango's Business, but according to Panamera, that was a terrible name. She suggested that the name shouldn't be changed, but kept as it was. The following morning, rumors began to spread throughout the city that Van had become an earl, a powerful hero, who defeated the mighty and fearsome dragon. These rumors, though considered exaggerated, greatly diminished Panamera's achievements. Panamera is confident that things will get even more interesting. Panamera left the village a month and a half ago, and development here has progressed rapidly. They succeeded in building Mabel Estelle, although it was not possible to use all the facilities due to the limited number of people. The residents of Bonds now live quite comfortably and have been relocated to the center of the village for greater convenience in commuting. In addition, Van succeeded in erecting 2 towering skyscrapers. It allows people to enjoy a spectacular view. Suddenly, Dono and the other guards arrived. Dono curiously asked Van if he intended to use the tower as a gymnasium. Without hesitation, Van immediately climbed the tower, and it took him 10 minutes to reach the top. Van looked tired but still full of enthusiasm. They watched the beautiful sunset together. Van pondered how the village was too large for only 100 people to live in. Till agreed with Van's assessment that considering the infrastructure and development of the village, it truly deserved the title of a town. Van suggested that people call their place of residence Van's Village, but Van himself disagreed with that name. He believed that if they built a town, it could be named Van. However, that name was rejected by Van himself, who did not want his name associated with the place. Suddenly, Kamshin spotted something in the distance. Van squinted but still couldn't clearly see what Kamshin was pointing to. Van thought Kamshin's eyes were as sharp as the villagers'. Kamshin said he saw a group of people approaching the village. They weren't soldiers or adventurers, as the group included many children and elderly people. Van was somewhat surprised by Kamshin's keen observation skills, which demonstrated his excellent eyesight. Kamshin estimated they would arrive in about an hour, so the group decided to go downstairs and eat first, as Till had prepared his favorite dish, omelets and sandwiches. As he descended from the tower, Arut hurried towards Van. Van was captivated by Arut's adorable appearance. She decided to stay in the village while Panamera went to the capital. There, she would be taught many things. Arut was still out of breath after the run, then asked Van what Arut wanted to convey. Van thought Arut was still a child and couldn't understand any romantic feelings, so he gently patted Arut's head affectionately. Arut blushed with embarrassment when Van patted him like that. The little girl then announced that many people would soon be coming to the village and asked Van what he should do. Arut noted that the village was not surrounded by walls, suggesting the possibility of leading newcomers to Van's office. Van noticed that Arut was starting to get used to his presence, though he was still a little shy. But he also acknowledged her maturity. Van agreed to Arut's suggestion, bringing the new group to his office with the aim of ensuring a friendly relationship between the parties. At that moment, Arut whispered to Van that Orto was still deep in the forest. Van immediately ordered Kamshin to summon Espada and Dono. Kamshin quickly departed to summon them. Van was very impressed with Kamshin's efforts. Van realized that Kamshin had been training hard with Dono. This made Kamshin's swordsmanship skills superior, even surpassing Van's. Lango and Belle were also evenly matched rivals in training. When the new group arrived at the office, Van ordered their representative to be brought in. An old man walked in and asked if this was the village of Seat. This left Van feeling confused. Meanwhile, an old man looked around in astonishment. He was speechless at the changes that had taken place in the village since he was a child. Seeing that the old man didn't answer, Van shouted again, startling him. He explained that they came from a nearby village. In a place where there are no more young people, they still have to pay taxes to the kingdom at the old rate. They tried everything but failed, so their only remaining option was to migrate to the village of Siat. Van suddenly realized that people from the neighboring village wanted to move to their village. He wondered why so many of their young men were disappearing. The old man replied that those young men had been conscripted into the army by the kingdom. He said that when there are no more young people, they will no longer be able to pay taxes. Moreover, Count Ferdinand had no interest in frontier communities like theirs. Van then realized they were Count Ferdinand's subordinates, and he immediately asked why they wanted to migrate to this village, despite knowing the distance between villages. The old man replied that the reason they came to this village was because they feared being discovered and punished by the Count. Therefore, they decided to go to the Viscount's village instead. Van thought for a moment, realizing that accepting them would be seen as an act of kidnapping, causing a major uproar. Van also understood that they might develop a negative view of him. These villagers risked their lives to get here. Van wanted to prevent conflict, but also didn't want to see others suffer. Ultimately, Van decided to accept them. The old man looked very happy. Van announced that no taxes would be collected for the time being, but they had to cooperate with the village community. Their representative, the old man, was even more delighted. Then Van asked about their population. Van was delighted to welcome the migrants from the neighboring village and decided to ask Orto to escort them on their journey. Van immediately offered them a rest for the day, as they now had plenty of food and beds. The old man said he wasn't their village chief, which surprised Van because he thought the old man was. Outside, other migrants stood staring blankly at the house in front of them. They still couldn't believe they were staying here, especially since this house was even bigger than the home of a feudal lord. A child said that a feudal lord would never be kind enough to lend his house. From afar, Vaughn just smiled and listened, for he was the kind of feudal lord who would readily lend his house. Moreover, the furniture in his house is much better. Van ordered all the migrants to hold a welcome party tonight. Everyone was surprised and delighted. Van then instructed Till and Komshin to immediately inform the villagers and guide them in preparing food. Komshin readily agreed. Arut, who had just arrived, asked what she should do with them. Van suddenly realized that Arut was the Count's son. Van explained everything to Arut about what was about to happen. Arut felt this was the right decision because life here would be much better. Van asked Arut about her situation, having been in the village for 2 days. Van also asked if Arut wanted to stay there. Arut shyly replied that she was very happy to be staying. Van said that for now, they should forget about marriage because they are still children. Then he asked Arut what she wanted to do. Arut remained silent, struggling for a moment with her thoughts about what she wanted to do. Arut said she wants to marry Van in the future. Van innocently asked Arut if she really wanted to get married. Van's question made Arthur blush. Van thought he shouldn't embarrass women. He told Arut to forget what he had just said, but Arut's face turned even redder. Van then awkwardly stepped forward. They arrived at the place where the party was being held tonight. At the same time, Orto returned from the forest. Van was horrified to see Orto's team covered in blood. Orto apologized and explained that they had accidentally stumbled into the maze. Van listened attentively, then realized they had found a labyrinth surrounding the village. The villagers became excited when they heard the news that the labyrinth had been found. Espada proposed immediately reporting the discovery of the labyrinth to the capital. Van understood that they had to act quickly before his father could take over ownership of the labyrinth. Espada agreed and advised them to report discreetly. Van thought it would be ideal if he had a title to manage the labyrinth, but since the situation was unstable, they needed to act urgently. If there was a labyrinth nearby, they could open shops selling weapons and tools and prepare a defense force for the villagers. They also welcomed new residents. Van ordered the adventurers to deliver news to the capital and entrusted this task to Sarah. Sarah was surprised because she wasn't prepared for the sudden assignment, but Van explained that since Sarah was the one who discovered the maze, he would be the one to report it. Orto then suggested that reporting would be more effective if they did it together. However, Van had a different plan for Orto. He ordered Orto to stay behind and protect the new residents of the village. Van also prepared a large sum of money to pay Orto and the other adventurers. Upon hearing this, Orto immediately prepared himself and bid farewell, taking Sarah with him to the capital. Van gave Sarah his dagger because he would be going alone. Sarah was delighted to receive the gift from Van, and the other adventurers, seeing this, eagerly vied to take turns going to the capital. However, Sarah didn't care, as he had already received the jade dagger from Van. Orto's group will go to meet the villagers. Meanwhile, Sarah will go to the capital to report on the discovery of the labyrinth. On the day Sarah set off on his journey towards the capital, he was delighted to receive a powerful weapon crafted by Van himself. Sarah was incredibly excited when Van gave her the dagger. Because the dagger was lightweight and easy to use, Sarah spent her days and nights in a cheerful mood. Throughout the journey, he felt that when he was happy, the trip back to the capital went quickly and smoothly. Suddenly, he saw a destroyed and overturned carriage in front of him. He also saw an orc eating the horse. Sarah immediately realized what was happening. Orcs have an incredibly strong appetite. They are always driven by hunger, lust, and ultimately bloodlust. In other words, this orc will kill anyone in the carriage. However, Sarah felt very confident at this moment because he had a very sturdy dagger. So, with confidence, Sarah immediately attacked. In the darkness, a group of orcs continued to devour horses. From the overturned, horse-drawn carriage in the middle of the road, from a distance, Sarah immediately shouted, and he leapt toward the hungry orc. Despite his large physique, Sarah quickly took down each orc. They surrounded the carriage just as Sarah had suspected. He easily wiped out all the orcs without leaving a single one behind. The dagger was custom made by Van. It truly proves to be of exceptional quality. Sarah was extremely grateful for Van's request. Suddenly, from behind the door of the overturned carriage, a beautiful woman appeared. It turned out she had been hiding in the carriage to escape the attack of the orcs. She thanked Sarah for saving her and introduced herself as Furamilia. Sensing Sarah's high status through the mithril knife he carried, she suspected he was hiding something. Sarah was astonished and bewildered to have inadvertently saved a beautiful woman who had simply introduced herself as an ordinary adventurer. However, Furamilia sensed that Sarah was of noble blood and was concealing her true identity. Unsure how to respond, Sarah remained silent. Furamilia smiled slightly and politely excused herself, heading towards the capital. She felt she couldn't repay Sarah's kindness at this time. She promised to repay her on another occasion. After some hesitation, Sarah mustered the courage to invite Furamilia to travel to the capital with her, as they both had the same destination. Furamilia didn't want to bother Sarah, but he insisted on inviting her to ride his horse, saying that the horse would be happier being ridden by a beautiful lady like Furamilia. Furamilia chuckled softly at Sarah's joke. She felt it had been a long time since anyone had called her that, even though she was 30 years old. Sarah added that she looked much younger, like she was only 20. Furamilia smiled and thanked Sarah as they continued walking. When Sarah inquired about their destination, Furamilia sadly recounted that her bodyguard unit had been swept away by the flood, and her father, a nobleman, had died in battle, leaving the family devastated and their property confiscated. She had to work as a servant for other families to make a living. Furamilia felt ashamed and distressed for sharing this story, but Sarah with a warm smile reassured her that there was nothing to be ashamed of, because he himself was just a free man trying to make a living. With a reassuring smile, Sarah invited Furamilia to accompany him to the village where he lived, believing they would find suitable work for her there. Sarah added that it was also a place he protected, so Furamilia wouldn't have any regrets. Furamilia smiled warmly, her cheeks flushing as she accepted Sarah's invitation. Finally, they arrived at the Guild of Mages in the capital. An atmosphere of extreme excitement was unfolding because of the newly discovered Labyrinth. At the Mage Guild, they realized that the Labyrinth was located near the village that had defeated the Forest Dragon and the Armored Dragon, home to Lord Van Nefertio, who had just been promoted to the rank of Baron. The Guildmaster announced that they would prepare to establish a branch there. Therefore, supplies need to be purchased at a 20% price increase. In addition, those who successfully map the maze will receive a cash reward. All the adventurers in the guild cheered with joy. Sarah was there, being questioned by all the adventurers. He felt the atmosphere was too noisy. After spending a night in the capital, Sarah invited Furamilia to leave the Sorcerer's Guild and return to his village with him. He quickly prepared everything necessary for the trip, such as food and clothing, while a group of adventurers followed behind. Furamilia knew that Sarah had paid for her accommodation during her stay in the capital, which made her feel guilty for not contributing anything. She apologized, but Sarah didn't mind. Then Sarah asked her about her decision to accompany him to the village, and Furamilia replied with a warm smile that she hadn't felt happy in a long time. Sarah also smiled proudly. Then he said that the lord of their village was very young and intelligent, and that she could have high hopes for him. Sarah was confident that the village would bring a smile to Faramilia's face, and she was very excited about it. At the same time, Ordo and his team were escorting refugees from a nearby village, with hundreds of people lined up, ready for the journey ahead. Ordo continued muttering as he walked, still complaining about Sarah being the only one who possessed the black sword. Seeing this, Puriel reminded Ordo not to be careless. Recalling how they had been attacked by the forest dragon last time when they let their guard down, Puriel immediately ordered Ordo to return to his position. The guards were astonished to see thousands of people being evacuated into the city, and even more surprised when they all expressed their intention to join Orto's group. Clearly, many people died without ever knowing what the outside world was like. They witnessed their entire village starving to death. Orto realized that leaving this place was not an easy decision. Then he saw a woman whose face was filled with sadness and despair. Orto immediately inquired about her situation, and she said she opposed the plan because she believed they would only be moving to an area even worse than their old village. Ordo explained that her thinking was wrong. Their village would actually be better than any city. They quickly arrived at the first gate, and Ordo proudly showed the newcomers their village. The newcomers simply looked around in silence. Upon entering the village, they were warmly welcomed by Van and the villagers, along with a lavish feast. The lord of the neighboring village quickly approached Van and thanked him for his generosity. Van politely introduced himself, and he also thanked the lord for his support. Puriel, standing behind, asked Van about the meat they were eating, and it turned out to be meat from giant wild boars. monsters that had appeared from the direction of the lake and were causing trouble, capable of paralyzing others with magic. Van laughed and said that their ballistas had wiped out all the wild boars in a single attack. Ordo burst out laughing at that. Suddenly, a child approached Van and asked for some meat. Van readily agreed and told Till to prepare meat for the villagers. The child was surprised that their party was so lavish that it could last for 2 weeks. Van then shouted to everyone not to hesitate to take food because there was still plenty left. The newcomers and the villagers blended in warmly and cheerfully. They were extremely grateful to be able to enjoy delicious food again. Both Van and the villagers were delighted, and the newcomers were also pleased by their hospitality. Van felt very satisfied because he made an effort to build enough houses and organize a barbecue for 300 people before the newcomers arrived. Before they arrived, Van had erected support pillars around the village. So now the only thing to do is create a suburban area for adventurers who want to rest after returning from the Labyrinth. Van believed that the front part of the village was the ideal location for this area. Furthermore, he planned to create this zone to deter criminals and suspicious individuals from entering the village. Van was confident that he could build the city within a month. With the capacity to accommodate 400 people and create a stable image for the travelers and adventurers who live there, the buildings will be multi-story, and one of them could house at least 10 people. Van also planned to build a 500-meter-long wall with 3 ballistas aimed at the wall and 15 others for protection. He also planned to lock the ballistas so that no one could adjust their direction downwards. Espada whispered from behind, announcing that a branch of the Adventurer Society would be building structures here, and therefore Espada suggested preparing the city to receive them. Espada asked Van if he would like to open shops and supply equipment for adventurers. Espada thought Van should consider it. Van replied that they would benefit from it because there was still much work to be done and it was all worthwhile. In this regard, Van needed to find representatives to manage it. He said that it was necessary because there needed to be someone to manage the city. What needed to be done now was to find someone to take care of the shops, in other words, the shop owners, as well as a city manager. According to Van, it would be best to assign this job to several people, not just one. Espada agreed, as they might still need to build up a strong force of their own. Fortunately, Lango was here and they also had the necessary transportation and facilities. They just need to decide how to protect the city because there will be many people trying to steal and commit crimes. Van agreed, and they decided to do it all. Van said he would let some people handle things themselves, while Bell and Lango would take care of the rest. They will also seek out suitable adventurers to join the Night Watch. Van entrusts the responsibility of representing the knights to the Espada, and Espada immediately understood his mission: to become a manager and recruiter of talented individuals. Espada will choose soldiers for the city and the village. That is, he will be the commander of the village's defense force, while Espada will lead his own army. After the discussion with Espada, Van happily returned to see the party in progress. At that moment, Arut approached Van with a shy smile and invited him to come along. Van explained that he wanted to talk to some of the villagers, and that it might not be polite, so they could eat while they walked. Art didn't mind and agreed. Kamshin and Till also wanted to eat while they walked. Van looked around and saw that all the seats were full, so he approached a young man and asked to borrow 3 chairs. Seeing that a respected man like Van had made the request, the young man quickly brought 3 chairs, happily complying with the order. Van whispered his thanks and also suggested that the young man could join the Knights of Ronda, which was currently recruiting. The young man was surprised and said that he would consider Van's offer. With a proud smile, Van felt he had found a member for the team, and thus he went ahead of Espada. Suddenly, a group of new residents approached Van, offering help if he needed it, saying they were willing to do anything to earn money. Van realized that the more people there were, the more jobs there would be. He immediately asked the new residents about managing the shop and inn he planned to open. Van also said they could do farming if they wanted. One of them replied that they didn't mind farming but had never run a business before. They explained that the business only involved dealing with customers, managing materials, and cleaning. Van said they would all be paid. The village chief of Ronda approached, saying that ever since Van arrived, their lives had truly prospered, and he hopes to be able to bring smiles to people's faces. With a genuine smile, Van replied that this was just the beginning. They will work together to make each day enjoyable, so they have to work hard. That evening was truly lively and joyful, with all the residents and newcomers happily integrating and interacting. Van knew that the village was ready to welcome both residents and visitors. Therefore, they could only hope for a happy future. With all his enthusiasm, Van shouted that from now on they would begin building a new city. And today, the residents of Rhonda Village will begin construction work. As the population grows, they must prepare for future population increases. Currently, the able-bodied residents are pulling a 1-kilometer-long rope from the village, and now is the time to build a new village for adventurers. Meanwhile, the newly arrived elderly residents will take care of the livestock on the farm, as they have always done. Abgalu also readily provided them with grass and water. The new children were delighted with their new home. They were thrilled to explore the entire village with the residents of Rando Village. Van was happy that more and more people were coming here. Later, while Van was supervising the construction, a new guard approached and asked if he needed more wood. Van replied that he currently needed at least 1,000 logs or more. The guard then invited his group back into the forest to cut down trees, and the whole group got ready. Van didn't realize that a night watch team had already been formed. It was clear that they had all been recruited by Espada beforehand and had signed contracts. Van realized that he hadn't fully understood all of this. However, with Dono as captain and 2 assistants, Van can still assemble a team of 20 people. But Van found that number too small. However, he also understood that they were still in the process of building a new city and would soon have another team. Suddenly, Kumshin approached Van and said that a medium-sized horse-drawn carriage was heading in their direction. Van recognized it was Sarah, who was returning from the capital. Kumshin also mentioned that another horse-drawn carriage followed Sarah as she approached the village. Van and Till were surprised to see a woman next to Sarah. Till joked that perhaps this woman was someone Sarah had rescued on the road and they had become close friends. Arit was the one who challenged Till's theory, and she felt it was quite plausible. However, Van wasn't sure if reality was as rosy as it seemed. Kamshin went on to say that it was probably because Sarah was very agile and able to spot enemies, and he was also skilled at tracking and neutralizing traps. Kamshin also added that Sarah's swordsmanship was exceptional. Van was surprised to learn that Sarah was actually that powerful. Suddenly, Sarah arrived with a displeased expression, realizing that he had just been the subject of gossip from Van and the others behind his back. Van smiled and greeted Sarah warmly. Van also asked the woman who she was. Sarah then replied that he had brought her here because she had no ulterior motive, and that Sarah had brought her there. Furamilia then bowed politely, and Van said that he had agreed to let Furamilia stay, as they had just welcomed 300 new residents. Sarah was surprised to see how many newcomers there were. Till then introduced himself and Van as the lords of the area. Furamilia also introduced herself, recounting her encounter with Sarah, who had rescued her from a group of orcs, filled with sadness. Till and Arit blushed, as their hypothesis was correct. Sarah felt embarrassed by being described in that way, and felt humbled because she felt uncomfortable. But for Furamilia, she believed Sarah was greater than any hero in the stories. Till and Arit were thrilled to hear her story. Van asked Sarah about the group of people behind them, and it turned out to be a group of adventurers ready to explore the labyrinth. Sarah then said that after reporting to the group, these people followed him. He said that the group of adventurers might scare the villagers, so it would be best for them to camp outside the village. However, Van said they needed to make these adventurers trust the village so they could spread the good word about it. Van then instructed Sarah to wait for the group outside the village. While Van prepared their accommodation, he would set up a minimum security system, but also mentioned that Orto and Seatag were exploring the labyrinth because its location was quite challenging and potentially stressful. Sarah will then demonstrate her skills tomorrow. Sarah said goodbye to Van. When Van saw Furamilia and the noblewoman, he was very surprised. Arat then stated that the woman came from the noble Stratus family, and Arat had also heard rumors that all the men in the Stratus family had died previously, causing the family to be wiped out. Till felt sorry for the woman, as she was the same age as Till. But Furamilia said that she was actually 30 years old. Everyone was stunned and couldn't believe it. Van decided not to react as they needed to avoid mentioning the woman's age. Then Van immediately invited everyone back and continued building the city. They had to quickly construct protective walls and temporary housing. Van wanted walls that could keep out medium-sized monsters, so people could venture deeper into the village if something bad happened. Suddenly, they were approached by a group of fake adventurers. With frightening faces, the group of adventurers urged them to go inside the village because it was too dangerous outside. Surprisingly, despite their somewhat menacing tone and appearance, the adventurers were actually worried about them. They were strangers, but they had kind hearts. Then a guard approached, sensing that the group of fake adventurers was frightening Van and his friends. These adventurers belong to the White Oath group. Although their faces are terrifying, they are very kind-hearted. The guard asked Van why they were outside the village, as monsters could attack at any moment. Van replied that they would soon return to the village after waiting for the wood. The guard saw the walls of Rando village in the distance. This was his first time in the village, and he mentioned that he'd heard it was ruled by a young nobleman, and that the village was also very wealthy and had many people. Van felt a little confused by the title of minister, as it was clear the guard didn't know that Van was the lord of the area. The guard then asked Van why they were outside and laughed. Van then saw the remaining wood and demonstrated his extraordinary abilities to the newly arrived explorers. Van successfully created a temporary wooden gate for the explorers to enter. Everyone was baffled by what was happening. They were stunned and utterly surprised. Van's magic is very powerful, even though it's not elemental magic. Van said that the wooden gate would take about a week to complete. However, the explorers made a big fuss about it. They were surprised and amazed by the power of the magic displayed. Then Dono arrived, bringing a lot of wood. Dono said he had brought at least 30 logs. One of the adventurers, hearing the name Van, recognized that the boy was the lord they were talking about. When they heard Van's name mentioned disrespectfully, they became angry and challenged the person who had said it. Van sensed Dono's anger and felt a clear threat emanating from him. The adventurous guard then responded to Dono's challenge and asked him to step forward. But with just one slash, the soldier's sword was cut in two. Everyone was terrified by Dono's power. Since then, the name Dragon Hunter Knight Dono began to spread among adventurers. People started to be afraid and always greeted Dono warmly whenever they met him. They realized that this would make the area much safer. Meanwhile, everyone showed interest in Van, both as a lord and as a child. New adventurers kept asking all sorts of questions about Van, until Orto returned and was surprised by the changes that had occurred. Van then asked Orto where they had been all this time. Orto replied that they had been trapped in the labyrinth for a long time, but had finally been able to return. Seeing so many fake adventures in the village, Orto suspected that Sarah had returned. Van confirmed Orto's statement and added that Sarah had returned with a beautiful woman. Orto and his friends seemed unconvinced by Van's words. Sarah immediately returned to her horse-drawn carriage, saying that in a few days the Union officials would arrive to investigate the labyrinth's location, so they would begin exploring it tomorrow. Sarah also introduced Furamilia to her friends. After introducing Furamilia, Sarah immediately said goodbye and took her to the inn. Sarah and Furamilia looked so happy together that Orto and his friends couldn't believe their eyes. Van then explained that Furamilia had followed Sarah ever since she was rescued from a gang of orcs. Furamilia had always considered Sarah a hero. Van then thought about building a small house for the couple. Orto and his friends were surprised to hear this and felt envious of Sarah's situation. Van then asked Puriel about the condition of the labyrinth they had explored. Puriel explained that the monsters in the labyrinth didn't actually come out the labyrinth's entrance, but rather the entrance was near a dangerous cliff in the forest. The crack was very deep. Puriel added that the entrance to the labyrinth was very narrow, only wide enough for 2 people to pass through. Puriel was certain that the weather conditions inside the cave were typical of a labyrinth, as they had only entered it once. There were staircases leading straight down to the first level, and supporting pillars next to the entrance resembling ceilings, walls, and even crystal chandeliers. There was no doubt about it. It was a labyrinth, an hour-long train ride, and then 2 or 3 hours of walking through the forest. Van was slightly surprised to hear that, but Puriel explained that all labyrinths had one thing in common. They were surrounded by powerful monsters, often gathering in remote areas isolated from nature. Van understood that no one would build a village near such a dangerous place, but he thought it was worth a try. Puriel looked at Van and said, "The area surrounding the labyrinth is very dangerous, so constructing any kind of structure there, even just a tent, is highly impractical. However, that's the current situation." Van had some doubts about Puriel's intentions, and as expected, Puriel confirmed that Van would be able to build around the labyrinth. Van was concerned that the place was too dangerous to bring weapons like the ballistas there, but Puriel reassured him that they could protect Van because they were very experienced, so Van didn't need to worry. Van had to find a reason to avoid building there because it was too dangerous. He had to be careful not to fall into Puriel's trap. Van said he would join if the explorers could lead him to the entrance, and guarantee him the afternoon, a map, and good food. Additionally, Van requested that Kamshian, Til, Arut, and Espada be brought along, as they would be busy building in the village and would need plenty of bodyguards for protection. Van smiled slyly because of his selfish request. He was certain Puriel wouldn't take him to a labyrinth to build. But surprisingly, Puriel smiled and agreed. Everything was ready for the journey the next day, and Puriel immediately went to Orto to prepare. Van remained silent. Unexpectedly, Till, Kamshin, and Arut, those who were listening, could only remain silent. This time, they have to go into a labyrinth.